This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It is 3 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Do you ever have sort of blind spots, mental blockages, where you always come back to the same thing and you can't remember it? There's a phrase, forgive me for this, because you've heard this song a few times, but the tune hasn't changed. There's a phrase I came across when I was researching fixed odds betting terminals, or the so-called crack cocaine of gambling machines, which I find an absolutely crucial guide or lens through which to view questions about the role the state has in helping us help ourselves or helping us not harm ourselves. So if you remember, the toing and froing of fixed odds betting terminal legislation was, I don't know if it's over yet, but the stories we heard about people whose entire lives were destroyed by addiction to machines that I learned when researching them were designed with incredible levels of engineering, mental and technological engineering, to know exactly where the line is that keeps you pumping money into it. So exactly the sort of amounts that you would need to win to make you continue pumping your children's dinner money, your wages, your rent, your mortgage payments. You continue pumping it into these machines, which at one point you could stake £100 a throw on. And they calculated, when I put it in these terms, it's actually not that shocking when you think about it. Of course they would do if they were allowed to. They calculated precisely how much of your stake you would be given back in order to persuade you to keep putting more back in. It's infernal, actually. And the more I looked into it, the more staggered I was that this kind of thing goes unchecked and unchallenged. And fair play to, I forget which of the last several governments it was since 2010, but one of them did, I think, step up to the plate quite effectively on that. And it's a really helpful illustration. If you can remember what the phrase is, would you mind just dropping it to 84850, or you can WhatsApp it to 0345. It's something like some harm optimization or something like that. And it's an academic field of study. I wrote about it. That's how big this blind spot is for me. I wrote about it in my first book, How to Be Right, but I can never, you must have heard me do this 3, 4, 5 times. I can never remember what it is actually called. But it speaks to an absolutely fascinating area of our lives, your life and mine, and the role that government plays in all of our lives, in your lives and in mine. Because what the fixed odds betting terminals taught us was that unless legislation is introduced, unless legislation is enacted, unless actual laws are made, then companies dedicated to the pursuit of profit, dedicated exclusively to the pursuit of profit, and there's nothing wrong with that. That is capitalism, and it is the greatest engine to drive human ingenuity in the history of humanity. But what the governments must do, the role of society, I would say, rather than government, is to put checks and balances upon the rapacious pursuit of profit. Do you know, sometimes I feel so grateful to you for allowing me to have spent all these years working stuff out, often with always with your help, because that's all it is. You know, imagine if I'd stayed on newspapers. I'd probably be one of those people ranting about nanny state and not really understanding what it meant, but absolutely adamant that it's a bad thing, and why can't I smoke in my own car, and down with seatbelts and rah. But of course, the role of government, the role of society, is to put checks and balances in place to prevent the engines of profit, to prevent companies and individuals dedicated to the pursuit of profit to the exclusion of all else. That's the point. So, you know, we think about the payday loan companies. Is this just because we've got a new government now that we've got all of these little memories coming back from the last 14 years? Because that was under David Cameron. Do you remember the payday loan companies? We'd speak to people whose lives had been destroyed because they'd borrowed £100 to go out one Saturday night. And then they hadn't been able to pay it back because the interest was so punitive. So they'd borrowed 200 quid from another one, and then 3. And then suddenly people who had borrowed 100 quid were facing, life-changing, home-losing levels of debt. Why? Because the people that ran those companies were allowed to. That's all. The people who ran those companies were allowed to. Now, you could, there it is, Craig. State corporate harm maximisation, it's called. Thank you. Finally, I feel seen. Thank you, Craig. State corporate harm maximisation. So the role that the state plays is in the absence of legislation, and the role that the corporation plays is in the rapacious and untrammelled. God, they're good words. Aren't they good words? Rapacious and untrammeled? The rapacious and untrammeled pursuit of profit. Put the two together, and what do you get? You get fixed odds betting terminals into which you're allowed to put £100 a nanosecond. You get payday loan companies that are allowed to charge the most vulnerable members of society, fiscally speaking, because if they weren't vulnerable, they'd be able to borrow money under more civilized terms. You get fixed odds betting terminals, you get payday loan companies, and I genuinely believe that you get junk food as well. I really do. We've talked about it a lot recently from the perspective of what happens in other countries, from the perspective of our children's lunches, from the perspective of the 4-course meals. Do you know what they did in France shortly after the last time we talked about school dinners in France? They realised that because parents in France, like parents in the UK, are often working at home time, the kids were not necessarily getting a good meal in the evenings anymore in the way that they would have done once. So now they give them a healthy snack to take home or to eat on the way home. French schools do that. Sadiq Khan tries to introduce free school meals for every kid in London, and people think that he's Joseph Stalin. In France, they realise that apart from the fantastic meals that they get every single lunchtime, they were perhaps not being fed to a similar standard in the evening. So in order to address that, they are giving children a snack to take home. Now, if you are groomed or gaslit or whatever the word may be into thinking that the nanny state is a bad thing or that the government should be smaller, you have to get very cross about the idea of children being given healthy snacks to eat. You have to say, down with that sort of thing. What's wrong with turkey twizzlers or spangles? They should just be given. I was fine. I was given a packet of Quavers and a tube of spangles, and it didn't do me any harm, you say as you recover from your third stroke. And so the idea of nanny state, of all the things that we've listed, and I'll run through the list for you in a minute. Can I have that list? It's not a very long list. I said to Eleanor this morning, I think the list might actually be complete. I think we might have begun and finished the list on the same day. The list of things that they try to tell us are bad for us, but which are actually good for us. And you could see that, really, as the chief project of right-wing politics, and particularly right-wing media, over the course of the post-war period. I think it was Aneurin Bevan who said something very clever about the purpose of the Conservative Party being to persuade Labour, with a small L, as in workers, to use its political power, as in its vote, to protect the interests of wealth, as in owners. I thought that was a very clever thing, and it speaks very much to state corporate harm maximisation. So if I talk to you about fixed odds betting terminals and payday loan companies, and the fact that government and rapacious profiteers combine forces to create an environment in which ordinary people can be filleted. So you don't ban gambling, and you don't ban loans, you just put limits on what can and can't be done. You don't ban food, you don't ban junk food, you just put limits on what can and can't be done. So next time you hear somebody call for smaller government, remember what you're listening to. You're listening to someone who wants less health and safety legislation. You're listening to someone who wants another bonfire of red tape, which David Cameron was boasting about before the Grenfell Tower tragedy showed us all what happens when you have a bonfire of red tape. You're listening to someone who uses phrases like lefty lawyers to describe the people that will protect you when it's your turn to be pursued. And you're listening to people who use the term nanny state. What do we want? We want less. Well, Andrew, flipping it, mate. You're paying far too much attention to the programme this morning. Did you see that, Keith? That's incredible. Will he have sort of special headphones on, or will he have been able to... Andrew's just texted me to say, don't use the mute button for the cough, but not for the sip. Oh, my God. You can't actually see it on YouTube at the moment, can you? You can't. You don't put it on YouTube until later. It goes up on YouTube as... Andrew, that's scary, man. I can't believe you did that. And you're absolutely right. I did indeed use the mute button for a cough, but not for it. Mate, Andrew, stop it. All right, seriously. I'm frightened to scratch now. I'm frightened of scratching in case you think I'm picking my nose. Stop it. All right. Whoa, paranoia. So state corporate harm maximisation is, I believe, as applicable to junk food and high caffeine energy drinks as it is to payday loans and fixed odds betting terminals. Can I be a tiny bit cocky just for 20 seconds and suggest that you hadn't necessarily thought of it like that before? It took me years to arrive at this conclusion. I'm not sure I would have done if I hadn't been so hypnotised by the phenomenon of fixed odds betting terminals. They're designed to literally hypnotise you, to draw you into a kind of trance in which you put all your wages into the pockets of already extremely wealthy people. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought that's what we need society for. That's what governments are for. To put some measures in place to protect us almost not from ourselves, but from people who will suck us dry given half the chance. People who will profit from our misery and our illness. So you don't ban sausage rolls, but you perhaps think about a ban on selling 3 sausage rolls for 10 pence more than 2 sausage rolls, because that encourages someone to eat 3 instead of 2. That brings us back to my adventures in Bangkok airport that I've shared with you on a few occasions. So I suppose the first question then becomes, do you buy this? Do you think I'm right? Do you think that we should put processed food, high caffeine drinks on the same page as fixed odds betting terminals and payday loan companies? In other words, should the government introduce legislation to, for example, limit advertising, ban the advertising? We carry adverts for some junk food companies on this programme. I don't know whether that would be covered by the ban, but please don't think for a minute that that compromises our ability to have the conversation, or indeed that I have the power to determine what adverts are and are not carried on this programme. I wouldn't want to. That's what the laws are for. It shouldn't be something that comes down to personal intervention. It's what society should be deciding about what is good for all of us. So that's question number 1, which is a bit of an odd one for a radio phone-in programme. But can you resist and give me the proof, if you like, that I'm right? So your relationship with junk food actually does merit comparison with a gambling addiction or with the process of getting sucked into a payday loan company. Because the obvious question to ask is, should the government be banning junk food ads? Should it be prosecuting shopkeepers who sell energy drinks to children? That's something we've not done together. How much damage do energy drinks do to children? There's a lot to put on the list today. There's no excuse not to ring in. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Junk food advertisements will be banned from television before the 9 p.m. watershed. That's it. That's law. That's happening. Online adverts for products that are high in fat, salt and sugar will be banned altogether. The plan is childhood obesity comes down, and the burden placed upon the NHS in the future by illnesses in large part caused by these products will be massively reduced. So, as ever on this programme, I want to know what you think, but I also want to know why. So no one can argue that these adverts don't work. You know, Adverts pay my mortgage, remember. Adverts pay my wages. Adverts work. Companies would not spend hundreds of millions of pounds every year on adverts if they did not work. They persuade you to do things. Brilliant adverts persuade you to do it immediately. Really brilliant adverts persuade you to do it without you knowing you've been persuaded to do it. We've all got relationships with adverts. But huge levels of sugar, huge levels of salt, huge levels of fat are killing us. Killing us on a scale that is close to unique in the Western world. And whose job is it? Whose job is it to stem that flow, if not the government's? And that's the question. I don't want to get cross or have a fight with anyone today who thinks that the nanny state is a pejorative and is something that should be used as a negative. But if it's not the job of the government to stem the flow, just stem, not stop, to stem, to reduce the flow of fat, sugar and salt into our children's bloodstreams, into our children's bodies, then whose job is it? Because I'll tell you something for nothing. If you are pushing your baby home from the bus stop and you pass 5, 6, 7 billboards advertising fried chicken, beef burgers, fizzy drinks, crisps, chocolate, you name it, it's everywhere. You need a hell of a lot of help in understanding why that doesn't mean that they're all fine. They're shiny, good-looking models, slurping on a tin or munching on a bar. You need help from the government to do 2 things: to understand that all things in moderation is a good way to live. The constant bombardment, the constant exhortation to put all this stuff in our mouths, of course it's the government's job to say, calm down, lads. Just as it's the government's job to say, payday loan companies, sorry, you can't carry on doing that. Hey, building societies, banks, other loan companies with high but not obscene interest rates, that's a factor, it's a necessity of modern life. Fixed odd betting terminals. You can't get rid of gambling machines, but you can put a limit on how much money people can put into it over a period of time. You can turn down the maximum stake. Of course, that's what government should be doing. And that leads us, of course, to the final question, which is, why does it work so well? You know I'm always interested in that. Why does it work so well? Why will so many people listening to this either be absolutely convinced that I'm wrong, or realising for the first time that I'm right? Why does it work so well? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. Come at this from whatever angle you like. It's 20 past 11. Have you noticed I'm in that mood where I could carry on talking till 11? I think it's our friend, it's Andy's fault. He's made me nervous. I don't want to take calls because Andy's watching everything so closely. Okay, in for a penny, in for a pound. Give me a call and we'll talk about this after that.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10, 23, 10. Not 11, sorry. I see some people think I'm exaggerating when a caller comes on and says, I'm really nervous, James. And I say, don't worry, I'm so bad at this, I routinely get the time wrong on a regular basis, and I've been doing it for 20 years. It's 10:23. So quite a few people are a bit unnerved by that. Michael writes, I start work at 12, James. You just made me jump when you said it was 20 past 11. Mr. Baines writes, I'm going to be sacked. Chill, relax, it's okay. I threw an hour away. And Robin Somerset says it's 10:20, not 11:20, James. You almost gave me a heart attack. Which brings us back to junk food. Almost as if I planned it, doesn't it? Fat, sugar, salt, all the things that add enormously to the burdens of the NHS and diminish the quality of our lives. So why wouldn't the government get involved in stemming the flow? That's all. Is this one of those topics that the more you think about it, the less of a debate it becomes? That's why companies have to pay Tufton Street lobby groups millions and millions of pounds to pretend there's a debate here. Of course the government should be getting involved in this kind of thing. Otherwise we'll sort of turn into a nation of Jabba the Hutts. 24 minutes after 10 is the time. Last word before we go to the phones to Karen. You need to have been paying attention to appreciate the quality of this text. She writes, could you ask Andy where I put my keys? I'm sure they were right here a moment ago. Ellie's in Kilburn. Ellie, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I did a business studies degree at Manchester Polytechnic in the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
And I was absolutely horrified on like day 3 when I realised that all they were doing was basically training us up to be soldiers in the army of the corporate scandal of, war against the public.
With respect, what were you expecting to learn?
Well, I was innocent. I was a young person.
Yes, there's a brand.
I was a young person.
But there is. I mean, where's the line then between business being a force for good, or at the very least an inevitable factor of a functioning society, and what we're talking about, the state corporate harm maximisation, as it were? And how did you pick up on it so quickly after just 3 days?
Well, it was one of the presentations by the business skills chap who was one of these. I mean, he was like a professional salesperson, basically, and I was able to see right through it. And I thought, cripes, what have I got myself into here? But I think, yes, business is a force for good when it's got its harness and its saddle and its reins on, and that's the role of the government.
What a beautiful analogy.
There's no way that letting corporate business, the reason businesses are incorporated is so that in law they can be treated as an individual, no matter how huge they are. That's what incorporation means, embodiment, right? So they use that as a way to avoid the actual individuals within the company being legally sanctioned for the wrongs of the corporate body. Anyway, I'm getting a bit technical. Basically, people are generally trusting. I believe the majority of people are generally trusting. So if we go to a supermarket, for example, and we see all these wonderful, exciting-looking foods on the shelves, we're going to trust that along the line someone has decided that this is fit for eating.
It's a bit like, to jump from the payday loan companies, which were obviously obscene, to the global financial crisis of 2008, which was predicated by the mortgage crisis in America caused by people being given money they couldn't afford to borrow, which plays perfectly into your analysis, because if someone's lending you the money, you must be able to afford it.
Exactly.
Which would have been true in up to probably the 70s, probably the deregulation of early Thatcher years. It would have been true, but after that, it wasn't true. You know, the calculation was, can they afford to make payments on it starting now? Yes, right. Give them the money then, and if they can't make the payments, we'll take their house off them further down the line.
And it's the same thing with banking. You know, the bank manager used to be a very serious person. You had to prove that and now you've got, then you had payday loans, and then against your car loans, and then against your,
So this is what they mean when they talk about deregulation, or I mean, certainly in financial areas, or bonfires of red tape in health and safety areas. They mean take off the saddle, take off the reins, let the beast ride rampant through the crowd of people, and inhaling as much money as they possibly can without any thought at all for the people to whom the money previously belonged.
And I think one of the most important things is education of the population. We need to understand, yes, they can
which is the role of the state.
Exactly. And if we let our children understand what compound interest is when they're 14, which is when I learned about it, and I thought, no way, I'm getting a mortgage, thanks very much.
I do understand that. Not necessarily a path that everybody can go down, but I'm more interested in the denouement of your academic career. Did you change course on day 4?
No, I stuck it out.
Now you're the CEO of a massive payday loan company.
No. My world took a very different turn when I became extremely disabled, and having been brought up in a family of... well,
then you become more attuned, possibly, to the effort that is put into persuading people to act against their own interests. Ellie, thank you. I like Ellie's analysis enormously, because what happens now is that people who don't know what the words mean, if this debate were being conducted in a crucible of deliberate manufactured ignorance, you start throwing around words like communist or socialist. Nobody is objecting to the principle of profit. Nobody is objecting to capitalism. Nobody is objecting to horse riding. We're just saying everyone will be safer if you use a saddle. Everyone will be safer if there's a limit on how much money that person can take off you. If there's a limit on how much sugar and salt they can put in a biscuit. That's all it is. And yet, I don't know how much of the print media is owned by people who also have hefty investments in all of these other sectors, but you can be fairly clear that if someone is resisting calls to make you healthier, to make your children safer, healthier, happier, they are doing so because there's a few quid in it for them. Whether they're pathetic foot soldiers on the payroll of a Tufton Street lobby group, or whether they are actually the shareholders and the owners of the companies that are encouraging us to put all our wages in a fixed odds betting terminal, or to live exclusively upon a diet of crisps, or to take out loans that end up costing us 100, 1,000 times more than the original sum that we borrowed. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. The time is 10:30, except for Jason, who's been in touch to say, James, in your defence, I'm listening in northern Spain, where it is actually 11:30. So to me, you were right the first time. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:33, climate change as well, probably you'd put on the list, wouldn't you? Persuading people there's no such thing as climate change. That's probably the biggest one of all, or man-made climate change, the long-term harm to your own interests or your species, your family's interests that's done by believing that. And of course, you know, and I know that the Institute of Economic Affairs, Policy Exchange, the Centre for Policy Studies, the Adam Smith Institute, all of these organisations which are in the space of opaquely funded groups putting forward positions without anybody knowing who's actually sponsoring the process, pop up on broadcast all the time, pop up in print media all the time, including still, sadly, LBC. But there you go. I mention that because the next question I'm going to ask you is this. Why does it work so well? There's something as obvious as trying to reduce the amount of salt, sugar and fat that your children consume. When it becomes government policy, why does it work so well? Why does the phrase nanny state reach your ears as a bad thing? I want you to think about that, and I want you to tell me on 0345 6060 973. So we're looking at broader elements of government proposals, no, not even proposals, plans to ban junk food advertising before the watershed, to ban high caffeine energy drinks, to go further in the pursuit of protecting people from companies that will kill them for money. And yet many people in this country, possibly many people still listening to this programme, have been persuaded that that is a bad thing. How does that work? 0345 6060 973. Imagine a Tufton Street lobby group that somehow mysteriously commissioned research secretly funded by a zoo owner that said we don't need cages in zoos. Let's get rid of all the cages in the zoos. Let the animals roam free. What would you say to that? You say, it's nanny state. Cages in zoos. It's just the nanny state. If you behave responsibly and you're a decent parent and your children won't get eaten by a lion, you'll be able to walk through the lions and you don't need cages. It's the nanny state. It's the same. It's an extreme example, but it's the same. Rachel's in Highgate. Is she? What's going on with my switchboard? Yes, Rachel is in Highgate. Rachel, what would you like to say?
Hi there.
Hello.
I really understand the kind of the nuances in this, and I'm probably coming from a relatively biased position as someone who's experienced difficulties with an eating disorder. But
Yes.
I think when we're talking around kind of junk food, it's really important to kind of not demonize certain foods, just because of the impact that can have on young people's relationship with food. Whilst banning ads obviously is, if it's an all-out ban on ads, then maybe, you know, the kind of language won't even be seen by young people, so it kind of is neither here nor there. But if you look at something like smoking or gambling, where you've got the kind of warnings on them saying, you know, smoking causes XYZ, cancer, etc., I think we need to be really careful if we're going to kind of treat food in a similar way, because then that kind of, given everything online and all these kind of influencers and the amount of people kind of touting different health advice, I think it's really important that the government maintain a kind of sense of common sense.
Hey, just let me pause you if I may. Let's try and zone in on what because you're covering an awful lot of ground. Let's try and zone in on. No, it's absolutely fine, and I'm very grateful to you. But health warnings on unhealthy food would be a bad thing. Why?
Because I think it's really dangerous to label foods as explicitly healthy and unhealthy. I know this might sound radical to...
No, it doesn't. It doesn't sound
people,
radical. I'm not necessarily... I mean, you know, here's an apple and here's a bag of crisps.
Yeah.
Should there be any information available to the consumer as to which one is, I mean, you can use different language if it helps, but which one is healthier?
It's so tricky. And
I don't think it is, which is why I'm interested in learning from you.
Okay. So I think, whilst, of course, yes, an apple might have more vitamins and minerals, a bag of crisps, if you're actually about to go and do a sports class, a bag of crisps is going to adequately fuel you for that sports class more than an apple would. So I understand that in one point of view, you might, yes, 1,000,000%. Because, before a sports class, you need carbohydrates. Now, that's not to say that maybe, No,
I'm not. I'm sorry. I'm not buying this. Carbohydrates in an apple. But maybe my example was unhelpful. So if should someone be told that eating 10 bags of crisps is a bad idea, but eating 1 bag of crisps is okay? Should they be selling crisps that have a reduced salt content? And if they are, should they advertise on the packet that there's less salt in this one than in that one? Because that's a health warning.
I think in some ways,
tell me in a sentence, tell me what your problem is with the proposal of health warnings on food. Because I don't want to go down the road of arguing that in some circumstances crisps are healthier than apples, because respectfully, I think that's silly. So what is the problem with putting health warnings on really unhealthy foods? For example, a heavily caffeinated energy drink. You can't ban children from drinking it unless that goes hand in hand with an explanation of why you're banning children from drinking it, and that is a health warning.
I hear you, and I think that a health warning on things like highly caffeinated drinks, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I just do think we need to be careful about how it's being
I know
framed.
you keep saying that, and I'm trying to understand why. Sorry, I'm probably being a bit slow. Is it to do with that when they put calorie content on menus, that can really hurt people with eating disorders? That can be a terrible, and it was done with the best of intentions, but it adds to the almost obsessive nature of somebody with an eating disorder, and it makes everything worse for them when you put calories on a menu. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about?
I think this is kind of what I'm trying to get at, probably not very articulately.
That's all right. No, don't worry. It's my job, not yours.
So essentially, I think that, for instance, the NHS are kind of bringing in these scanners that you scan food and it tells you how much sugar's in it and stuff like that. And
what's wrong with that?
Because
how else will I know?
The average layman is not a nutritionist, and
to be fair, I don't. I mean, okay, but I want to know how much sugar is in my snack. I don't currently know. What's wrong with that? And I'm an average layman.
Yeah. I think, look, as I said, I'm coming from a biased position because of my experience.
We're all biased. I do understand, but what is it that would have made your experience worse? I don't want to hector you, Rachel. I really don't. But what is it that's been mentioned on the programme today that's made you think if that happened, it would have made my life even harder when I was suffering from an eating disorder?
I think the issue is that there's already a demonization of certain foods, and I think drilling down on that is going to make it even harder when people have such a black and white, experience of food. They go, oh, this is healthy, this is unhealthy. Yeah. I really at least in terms of I'm 23, and in terms of my generation, there's a whole generation of us that experienced kind of being told that we were bad for having chocolate, or we were being unhealthy if we wanted a dessert, or we were being naughty if we wanted crisps. And I think it's a really everyone, really? like my mum, my dad.
Yeah, I think that.
But I want to make it clear that it wasn't just my parents. It was advertising.
Well, as a parent, that's not my experience. And I mean, I appreciate the unachievable ideal of a body, but that's got nothing to do with a food warning on Monster Munch, and of course, or any other. Actually, I think they're probably comparatively quite healthy because they're a baked maize stack. Rachel, thank you. I'll think about a lot of the things you've said, but before you go, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Why do you think they bring oranges onto the pitch at half-time in a game of rugby instead of a bag of crisps?
I understand. Look, I get what you're saying.
I'm teasing you.
do.
I'm teasing you. I wanted to end with a smile. 10:43 is the time. Francis is in Amesbury. Francis, what would you like to say?
I think the problem we have with food is generally, it's been 50 or 60 years of drilling down. Junk food is the way. And if you look at countries like Japan, their culture is completely different. If you go out and you want to get a snack at lunchtime, you can go to a sushi bar. You can go and get healthier options. If you ask children what their favourite foods are,
I think part of the point Rachel perhaps was trying to make was that there's quite a lot of sugar in sushi. So if you go too far down this road, you end up almost painting everything as negative. And so then there'll be someone listening to this who says, fruit juice is bad for you, and they have a point. The fructose content without the fibre can have negative. But we're not actually talking. Maybe this is where I could have been more helpful to Rachel. We're not talking about that. We're talking about products that are high in fat, salt and sugar. We're talking about high caffeine energy drinks, and we're talking about banning junk food advertisements. We're not talking about demonising crisps. We're just talking about transparency almost. And what on earth can be wrong with transparency?
Yeah, I think there's a responsibility on everyone, including the government. So we have a responsibility to ourselves to put food in our mouths that is good for us at the time.
But knowledge is power, right? Knowledge is power. This is why I always think of the young parent pushing their pushchair past 50 billboards, getting home, turning on the telly in the daytime and watching adverts for things that are bad, really bad for you, and thinking they can't be because it's on the telly.
Right? Yeah, and that's what's built the culture over the last 50, 60 years. And trying to convince, 70, 60 million people, that not that junk food is bad, but we should be watching, what we and make better decisions, is going to cost a lot of money and a lot of undoing. I think.
But this is what seems to be what Starmer is setting himself up to do, isn't it? He's setting himself up big challenges and messages that people aren't going to want to hear. And that's why nanny state works. That's why shouting nanny state at the top of your voice gets people who don't like thinking too much opposed to things that are designed to help them, which brings us back to health and safety legislation, red tape, the politics of envy, and the nanny state. 10:45 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on 10:45 is the time, unless you're in northern Spain or elsewhere in the world. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:48. I remember tobacco ads being normal, writes Mike. I can still remember the Hamlet one. They were brilliant adverts, actually, and really brilliant adverts. What was that music? Was it Air on a G-String by Johann Sebastian Bach, was it? Was it? That lovely music that used to come on in the background, something to... and that was normal, and none of us realised it was bad until you look back in anger and realise that, you were being encouraged to do something. I mean, go back far enough. I think in this country, definitely in America, you'd have doctors promoting cigarettes as a health aid. You think I'm joking? It's true. Long after the genuine health impacts of tobacco and of smoking had been established, they'd continue to do it. And it's not exactly Colombo territory, is it? Why is that, James? Well, because they were making billions of dollars, children. And when the government said stop, they moved everything they could. Think of the fossil fuels lobby. They moved everything they could to stop governments from stopping them making money. So what the hell is the role of the government if not to protect the population from interests that wish them harm? Not from some form of sadism, but from sheer unadulterated greed. Profit is good. Business is good. It's necessary. It's a human engine. But so are checks, balances, speed limits. Driving's great. No one wants to ban motor cars, but who thinks speed limits are a bad idea? Don't ring in on that one. That's the last thing I need. 10:49 is the time. Mike's in Hull. Mike, what would you like to say?
Just that I completely agree with the ban. If you look at historically how ads affected kids, the sale of toys, and particularly the sale of fast food, they're effective, and they have been effective. And if they're causing a problem, it's as simple as you say. They should be banned. I can't see any issue with that at all.
Even the you don't get them right next to the tills, do you, anymore in supermarkets?
No, absolutely. Was that banned, or is that something supermarkets have done on their own volition?
I think it was legislation. I think it was legislation to stop, because you still get it in convenience stores. There must be a limit on the size of the shop, which means it must be a law. So you're not, it prevents you from. We've all been there, both as a child and as a parent. We've had that, well, not all of us, but we've had that conversation. No, you can't have a Bounty. Put it down. It's absolutely. But then you're in the queue and everyone's looking at you and everyone thinks you're a terrible parent. You want your child to stop crying. Oh, go on then. All right. Give me half.
I don't think the issue is so much, though. As much as we are talking about the banning of the ads, it's a bigger, wider issue. It's an unseen issue as well. We live in a society that's had the effect of fast food ads for 50, 60, probably going on 70 years. And the effect it's had, it's part of our culture now. So there is that issue in terms of people resisting wanting them taken away. But
we haven't done much. It's already 10:02. We haven't done much on the psychology of why it works. And I think you've just hit the biggest nail on the head, actually. It's here is something I've got, and here's someone who wants to take it away.
Yeah, and it's something that our grandparents... Yeah, certainly.
It wasn't that big a deal. I don't know if our grandparents were enthralled to junk food adverts. I suppose it depends how old you are.
Well, I would say so. Certainly they've been around, certainly in the US, since the 50s. Huge billboards for fast food since the 50s. And certainly in the 70s.
Oddly, and we're splitting hairs now, for which I apologise. I don't think it was as processed back then. I imagine if you went to a burger bar in the 50s, you would have recognisable bread that wasn't full of additives. I don't know. Now
we're on to a different issue.
We are. You're quite right, and you're right to rein me in, Mike.
I think I've got a fairly unique perspective because I am a chef.
Oh.
And in a previous life, I was a secondary school teacher and a primary school teacher, for that matter.
Good Lord. You are supremely qualified to contribute to this conversation.
Yeah, a fairly unique perspective.
Yes.
But my biggest gripe, and the reason, the first time I've ever called in, and it was, I must take umbrage with what you said.
What?
To the previous caller about the choice between the apple and the packet of crisps.
Okay.
Because that is the biggest issue. This is the biggest issue we have as a society, is education and attitudes towards nutrition.
Yes.
And it's not fair to say that a burger is an unhealthy food.
No, I just pointed that out when I was talking about a healthy burger.
It's an attack on you.
Yeah.
But a lot of people do take the view, and it was taught when I was at school, I was taught these are unhealthy foods in red, and these are healthy foods in green. And it's nonsense.
No.
You need a balance of nutrition.
Absolutely. And the word we're not using enough is processed, isn't it?
No, I don't even agree with that either.
Well, then we're going to have a row.
Defining processed food is extraordinarily difficult.
Presence of additives,
example,
gelling agents, gum. I'm eating bread that has got stuff in it that will.
If I were making you from scratch a creme brulee, I might very well use a gelling agent.
Which one?
Xanthan gum. Perhaps.
Pardon?
Or a xanthan gum I might use, or I might use
I don't need to use xanthan gum to make a creme brulee.
No,
I just use egg yolks.
High volume, you may well do in a restaurant, but
that will be less healthy than the one that hasn't got it in.
Product.
That will be less healthy than the one that hasn't got it in.
Why?
Because it will turn to mush in my tummy. It will clog up my insides, like the kid at my school who ate 18 pot noodles. He had 18 pot noodles, and they had to take him to hospital to unclog his insides.
Well, yeah.
It'll be just like that.
I'll let you have the pot noodles.
I take your point. I take your point about what might you call it, kind of nuclear level labelling, as in good, bad. But burgers are a great example. We burger off the barbecue, probably bad gases and what have you, and the bread, depending on when it's made. But I disagree with you about processed food. It is pretty clear what substances and what additives are making your food less healthy, and what substances and additives are not. And of course, that includes things like salt and sugar, but all things in moderation. Why did you change from teacher to chef, Mike?
I've had a few things in between.
Okay, it's quite a journey.
Long and varied career.
Are you happy now?
In some respects. Yes.
Yeah, professionally, I meant, really.
Well, I was professionally happy before. Just a completely different challenge, and I've had a few different careers.
Keep yourself engaged? No, I like it. I haven't. I was thinking that yesterday. I've only really done 2 jobs with a little sort of brief hiatus on daytime television. 10:55 is the time. Hannah is in Oxford. Hannah, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome.
I think this is probably, a slightly similar point to some of your previous callers and around the education. However, I'd say my angle, I've myself also struggled with eating disorders, and I've worked with a lot of different dietitians, some of which are very highly regarded within that world.
Yes.
And I think for me, I've been lucky in one sense to have such a negative view on food. I've had such education from people who really know what they're talking about to actually help me understand that healthy, unhealthy, and like what that actually means.
Yes.
And I just don't think you don't learn about that unless you're provided with somebody giving you that education, and again, somebody who really knows what they're talking about. You don't learn about that in school. You do have maybe the food charts, but they don't give you really good understanding of actually what it means to have a healthy diet. And also, there is so much food out there which is just stuffed full of stuff which we don't realise is actually the unhealthy stuff versus actually, in moderation, a bit of salt, a bit of sugar and fat. We all need those in our diet. Of
course we do. I wonder where the line is, because there's a danger, and I think the calls today have highlighted it, and so have I, of picking off the things that are achievable, which is what the government is trying to do. There's a big difference between a conversation about banning junk food advertisements from television before the 9 p.m. watershed, or getting rid of online ads for products that are particularly high, especially high, notably high in fat, salt and sugar. That's a pretty straightforward legislative move. A conversation about the dangers of having a catch-all definition of healthy and unhealthy, or the presence of fructose in fruit juice, or that is a much more nuanced and a much more sophisticated conversation. And we've probably allowed ourselves to be a bit distracted today by the second conversation, away from the pertinence of the first. Who could object, for example, to a ban on junk food advertisements when children are likely to be watching television?
Well, I think what annoys me is it's not even just with food. I just get really annoyed with the whole idea that companies profit off people's struggles or weaknesses or addictions. Same with the gambling. I just think it's just so wrong morally. I just get really angry about it.
I'm sure you do, but you can't. If you take any example, if it has an incredibly negative effect on a relatively small minority of people, that I don't know that that's ever grounds for banning everybody from using something or from doing something.
No, I mean, the advertisements I'm not completely against, because I think there's far more better things that we could be advertising. And people are very aware of what they can pick up in the shop, because they're already picking them up. It's a bit late to try and think that that's going to be the game changer. But I think it does start with maybe changes like advertisements and proper education. And it's not just going to be one thing that fixes it. Like, we're kidding ourselves if we think advertisements, it might help a little bit, but it's not going to stop and all the health problems people are having.
No, but I do think, I don't know, at risk of patronising you, when you have small children, the things they've seen on television automatically become the things they want. And it is just a thing. Whether it's Christmas toys, you notice when the toy adverts start at the run-up to Christmas, that will inform what children want to put on there. I mean, it's different now because of other media and other influences, but that is why it works. I wanted Crossfire. Did you? And I wanted Tin Can Alley, neither of which, in reality, I'm just alienating all my young listeners like Hannah now, neither of which, in reality, were much like what you saw on television. I thought Tin Can Alley came with a real gun. Crossfire was brilliant. I really enjoyed it, but it didn't look much like it did on the telly once you actually got it out of the box at home. But those were both on my Christmas list, and I got one of them. I had to wait until I won the premium bonds to buy myself Tin Can Alley. Hannah, thank you. Sarah writes that xanthan gum is an exudate from the bacterium Xanthomonas campestris, I knew that, which in human studies has been shown to negatively affect the human gut microbiome. It's gross that anyone would put it in a creme brulee. Well, it's not, is it? Unless you're living on creme brulee, in which case it may well do you some harm, which is why I used that rather hefty comparison with a kid at school who ate 18 pot noodles and had to go to hospital. I still remember his name, actually. It's amazing, isn't it, the things you can do at school to become memorable, as opposed to the things you did at school that should have made you memorable. But so I don't think one little pot of creme brulee is going to be problematic, Sarah, and in a way that's the point of this whole conversation.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11 is the time. The topics that we could do almost every day, but you have to choose your moments carefully, almost write themselves. There's an extraordinary story about some of the alleged journalism regarding Israel at the moment in the news. The Jewish Chronicle in this country facing allegations of having run stories that were part of an Israeli government disinformation campaign under the byline of a journalist who certainly seems to be posing more questions than answers. It's a remarkable investigation. There's a piece about it in The Guardian today, and it reminds us, of course, that we could talk about the continuing carnage in Gaza and the horrors in many ways of what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing, both to his own country, but more obviously to the Palestinian people through his desperation to cling on to power above all else, up to and including, in the views of many hostage families, the hostages themselves. So you could talk about that every day, and you could talk about Russia every day. You could talk about Ukraine every day. But it is a long time since we talked about Ukraine. And one of the things that prompts the conversation is an escalation. It's a grim fact of human life. But, when things are happening every day, they become less... They never become less shocking or less heartbreaking, but they become less abnormal than when they're happening rarely. And an escalation such as the one we're seeing in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is a point at which we should pause and wonder about what is going on and what is likely to happen next. So this is a deeply significant moment. You will have heard in the bulletin that they've already started chucking out diplomats. That generally is par for the course. It means that Putin is rattled by noises coming from the West, and those noises chiefly are Keir Starmer and Joe Biden essentially approaching a position where Ukraine will be able to fire missiles into Russia, deep into Russia. I just want you to stop and think about that for a minute, because I don't want this conversation to be conducted in a gung-ho fashion. So Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Ukraine did not want to be invaded. Ukraine continues to resist furiously the attempted annexation by Vladimir Putin. Two factors possibly see Ukraine pursuing a different fate than Crimea, and that is A, the quality and strength of resistance, which was largely unexpected by the Kremlin, and B, the international cooperation, the international support. I mean, let's get the depressing stuff out of the way early, shall we? If Kyiv had fallen on day one, or day three, as Vladimir Putin thought it would, I think that Ukraine would probably be today like Crimea was 10 years ago. I don't think there would have been international outcry. I don't think the West would have funded or indeed armed an underground guerrilla resistance. I could be completely wrong. I'm not sure anybody can answer this question clearly. But history suggests that if Putin were able to present his conquering as a fait accompli, then the Western order, the NATO allies, would have sort of fallen into line behind it with objections and things. But I don't know. You think back to how Cameron handled Crimea and you get back to me. But we're looking at a significant, Vladimir Putin himself describes it as a move that would change the very nature of the conflict, forcing Moscow to respond. He says that it would mean that NATO countries are at war with Russia. Technically, I don't know that that's true. But he said, we will take the appropriate decisions based on the threats that we will face. In a way, there are parallels to be drawn between Vladimir Putin and Benjamin Netanyahu. They both need war to continue for very different reasons of self-preservation. Vladimir Putin, almost certainly considerably richer than Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, possibly combined, needs to stay in power in order to keep his money. And in order to stay in power, he needs to do two things. He needs to destabilize the West so that his own citizens don't do what citizens of Ukraine did a few years ago and look to the West and think, why the hell aren't we part of that world order instead of this mad old business? And the more unstable the West becomes, the less attractive that option becomes to the people of Russia. And the second thing he needs to do is ramp up nationalism, ramp up both nationalism and victim narratives, because they go hand in hand together. The whole world is against us. We are the best. best, we are the greatest. And you can't really do that without war. And, of course, controlling the media. So the situation in which Ukraine finds itself today is fairly straightforward. It is in a situation of almost constant attrition. Some periods of time go well for Ukraine. Some periods of time go less well. The huge imbalance in forces has, I think, surprised everybody in the sense of Ukraine's successful resistance, and indeed successful retaliation. The talks at the White House today, and I don't know how big a stake Keir Starmer really has in this. It was always Tony Blair's justification, wasn't it, for getting fully into bed with George W. Bush, was that it's better to be there. You can stay their hand sometimes. You can be a critical friend. Off the top of my head, I can't think of much that Tony Blair stopped George W. Bush from doing on that catastrophic Middle Eastern path that he led us down. So I don't know. I mean, it's a British newspaper. I'm British. I like to think that the British Prime Minister can sit in the Oval Office and somehow have enough agency to influence the decisions taken by the American president. But it seems a little bit unlikely to me. Nevertheless, we're in lockstep with what American policy will be. So Keir Starmer and President Biden today will talk about letting Ukraine use British-made Storm Shadow missiles against targets in Russia. I don't think you need to be Columbo to know that this is almost certainly going to happen. The tone and the content of the coverage is crystal clear. They've spent weeks accusing Moscow of a significant escalation. They've taken 200 ballistic missiles from Iran, reportedly, for use against Ukraine. And the question that many people struggled with from the beginning, which is why Ukraine can't attack Russia, now moves into very, very sharp focus. So I've stressed that I don't want the conversation to be gung-ho, but equally, I don't want you to feel excluded from this due to lack of knowledge, which is why I want to refer you, oddly, to a board game called Risk, which I used to play a bit as a kid, but not as much as some of my friends. And I never fully understood why it was so popular. But I do today, oddly. I understand its popularity today because its distillation of diplomacy, up to and including war, is almost perfect. It hinges upon one thing. I'm going to use the word rapacious again, and indeed untrammeled. It hinges upon the notion that regimes have a rapacious and untrammeled desire to expand. Now, that's no longer true. It was true for huge periods of human history, but it's no longer true. It's the process by which 150,000 Englishmen could enjoy dominion over 300 million Indians just 100 years ago. It's a rapacious and untrammeled desire to expand. Now, the UK doesn't have that anymore. And even if it did, there wouldn't be a great deal we could do about it. France doesn't have that anymore. Portugal doesn't have. The great powers of old largely don't have it anymore. China kind of has it, but only with one or two relatively small targets. And its expansion is more commercial than militaristic. It doesn't need to conquer countries in Africa because it has essentially bought them through what is usually called roads and bridges or bridges and roads. You end up investing in so much infrastructure in these countries that they can be in a form of hock to you forever. But Russia is different, I think. Russia does belong to that ancient tradition of rapacious and untrammeled annexation with an extra dimension of very specific history, which is, of course, the idea that the breakup of the old Soviet Union was an insult to Vladimir Putin's manhood. It was actually an emasculation of a nation that is felt keenly by individuals, that whole program of breaking up Mother Russia, breaking up the Soviet Union was an appalling betrayal of the communist tradition, or a betrayal of the imperial ambition, or a betrayal of the sacrifices even of the Second World War. But I don't think that matters much to Vladimir Putin. I think that is a stick that he uses to beat or to whip his supporters into a frenzy while also using it to beat his enemies. He needs war to stay in power. He needs to stay in power to keep his money, which means the prospect of peace in Ukraine, it's Belt and Road, forgive me, not Bridge and Road. It means the prospect of peace in Ukraine in the context of a Russian withdrawal is very, very slim. Russia need to be beaten. Russia cannot really be negotiated with to peace unless they are permitted to keep huge swathes of territory which is not rightfully theirs, in the way that happened in Crimea. And that's why many people have struggled up to this point to understand why Volodymyr Zelensky can order incursions into Russian territory, and has done so with some success recently, but he can't shoot missiles at Russia while Russia shoots missiles at him. I'll say that again. I'll make sure I've got my teeth in. They can't shoot missiles into Russia, even as Russia shoots enormous amounts of missiles into Ukraine. And how can that possibly be right? Answer, because if you shoot missiles into Russia, in other words, if you do to Putin what Putin is doing to you, then international diplomacy kicks in, and everybody who has helped Zelensky do this, up to and including the country in which the missiles were made, i.e. good old UK, become part of Putin's coalition of enemies, or rather the coalition of Putin's enemies. So the idea of poking the bear because the bear will respond explains why it has taken months, years of war and carnage and killing to reach this point. But there it is. I mean, none of that changes the fact that Putin is essentially a bloodthirsty dictator. Whatever the reasons for his addiction to annexation and imperial expansion, the addiction is the point. The addiction is the problem. And when the president of Russia says on state television that it would mean NATO countries are at war with Russia, it doesn't really matter whether he's technically correct or not. All that matters is that's what he believes, or at least that's what he will tell the Russian people, and that when he speaks of the appropriate decisions will be taken based on the threats that we will face, well, it opens up all manner of possible avenues, doesn't it? Russia started this conflict, Keir Starmer said on his way to Washington. Russia illegally invaded Ukraine, Keir Starmer said on his way to Washington. Russia can end this conflict straight away. Ukraine has the right to self-defense, and obviously we've been absolutely fully supportive of Ukraine's right to self-defense, providing training capabilities. But we don't seek any conflict with Russia. That's not our intention in the slightest. But they started this conflict, and Ukraine's got a right to self-defense. Slightly disingenuous, because there comes a point where the distinction between self-defense as the resistance of people attacking you on your own turf is different from self-defense in the context of you firing missiles into their turf. But I think it holds. It's clearly self-defense. Ukraine does not have any ambitions to annex part of what is currently Russia, which puts UK and the US firmly in the middle of the question of what happens next. So my view, and I'm far from an expert, as you've probably gathered, although I'm a little more clued up on some of these factors than I would have been a few years ago. My view is that you can't really negotiate peace with an authoritarian dictator. But unless you can beat him, unless you're confident you can beat him, firing missiles into his territory is an incredibly risky thing to do. If I were Keir Starmer, I'd be tempted to do it. I think I probably would do it, and I think he is going to do it. But none of us know what that really means, which is the point at which it's probably worth having a conversation. What does this story mean to you? What do you think? Should Keir Starmer and Joe Biden agree today, as they are expected to do, that UK-made Storm Shadow missiles will be fired at targets in Russia, on sovereign Russian soil, by Ukrainian troops, by Ukrainian soldiers? And whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, a necessary act or an unnecessary act, what will it mean? What will it do? What happens next? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 18 minutes after 11, and it's Well, it's time for some international relations.
James O'Brien on LBC.
And of course, one factor that I overlooked a moment ago is the prospect of Donald Trump getting back into the White House later this year and what that would mean for the situation in Ukraine. It may be a coincidence, but Donald Trump's every utterance seems to be, if not designed, then accidentally engineered to delight Vladimir Putin, up to and including, no doubt, the cessation of aid to Ukraine. So there might be an idea here of catalysing the next chapter, speeding things up a little bit, lest you have the adjudicated rapist, multiple felon and a self-described sex offender in the White House this time next year. Chris is in Aberdeen. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you?
I'm very well, mate. What's on your mind?
Listen, first of all, before I start, I'd like to thank you for helping me with buying my car. I know you did it unconsciously, but you did it last year. I was buying a wee Honda Jazz for my wife. The guy I was speaking to said he's a great fan of yours, which I am as well. And at this point, I knew this car must be right. You know, this is certainly the car.
Would you buy a second-hand car off this man? Well, yes, if he listens.
And I knew this point. He was a lovely man anyway, but he said, "Oh, I'm addicted to James O'Brien," which I am addicted to as well, by the way.
How's the car? How's it measuring up? How's it performing?
It's lovely. I'm actually sitting in it just now. I was meant to do the shopping, but I thought I'm going to give you a call, and I'm in that car as well just now. It's doing great, so well done.
Brilliant.
Well done.
Thank you. Well, lovely story.
What I wanted to say with regards to the situation we're in just now, if you think about it, Ukrainians are already in Russia, right? They've basically put their boots on the ground. They are in Kursk region. So as far as attacking Russia, it's already happened. They've already done it, and they've already done it with the use of U.S. weapons or British weapons or whatever. Those troops are already in there. As far as attacking inland Russia, it has already happened. The Ukrainian drones and whatever they can put their hands on are already targeting airports in Russia with better or worse precision by that. So if anything, I'm going to make a controversial point. Putin should be happy that they're going to be attacking with highly, precision weapons now instead of silly drones that they've made, which are which can actually hit, civilian buildings. It has happened.
Yeah.
Or I don't know whether it was Russian anti-air missiles or not, but there have been probably deaths and injuries because of that.
Long-range missiles being, and it's fairly brutal sometimes to talk in these terms, isn't it? Because you are potentially discussing human lives, but they are more surgical than the methods currently being deployed by Ukrainian forces on or above Russian soil.
Oh, absolutely. These are the best in the world weapons. They are weapons, of course. That there is a huge risk that civilians are going to get injured. But, Keir Starmer said it himself, that there is a way to end this war. Putin just take his troops away, apologizes, and that's the only and that's what happens. Putin will not understand anything and anything at all other than strength, integrity, and he has absolutely no chance with NATO. If NATO wanted to end that war, if all the effort we've put in across the past 2.5 years, we've put in within the first 4 months, that war would have been over, and we would probably have a revolution in Russia. And this is the only way that Russia changes itself, by revolution caused by the collapse of the usurper or the person that's holding the power.
So what would, I'm going to use the word retreat rather than surrender, but what would a retreat do in the context of Putin's position? Would it render Putin's position untenable, or could he style it out, so to speak?
Basically, that would be his death.
Yeah, so that's why he's never going to do it.
He's back in, absolutely, and the red lines he's drawing, the red lines he's drawn them all before. Using helping Ukrainians at all, helping Ukrainians with tanks,
so you're
helping
betting
Ukrainians with offensive weapons.
Yes.
He's already drawn those lines. And I'm going to make one more point as well. Putin's trying to threaten us that, we're going to be at war with NATO.
Yes.
Yes, but you know what? I've actually had a very unfortunate pleasure of watching quite a lot of translated Russian propaganda.
Okay.
telly, which has already been feeding that information to the society.
We're already at war with NATO.
Absolutely.
Right.
This is the argument he's using, because he cannot justify the war that he said he's going to win in 3 days by saying, oh, do you know what? That Ukraine they were meant to be beating in 3 wars? That wasn't Ukraine. That was actually NATO. We were at war with NATO. So that argument has already been made. So the only thing that is going to beat Putin is pure strength. And yes, it is some form of escalation, but again, I'm going to make an opposite point. The escalation would be not to allow them, because at the moment...
And that's always the nature of war, particularly a war against an acquisitive foe, an enemy that wants to occupy and annex territory. The only response is to stop them or allow them. There's not really any middle ground here, is there?
No, there isn't. It's a brutal war. And that's the only way to these weapons can actually finish it.
I like your analogy. I also like this message from Craig, who says, nefarious car salesmen everywhere are about to deploy the James O'Brien strategy in order to sell their cars to your trusting listeners. I hope you haven't opened a Pandora's box there. Can I ask? Are you from? Where are you from originally? Where do you?
I'm from Poland. I've got
some Polish people watch this
in that work.
Particularly interestingly because of that notion of annexation. If Ukraine today, then where tomorrow? Estonia are even more urgently concerned about that question. Can I ask you an interesting, a cheeky question?
Go for it.
How long had you been in Scotland, having grown up in Poland? No, wait. That's not the question. That's not the question. How long had you been in Poland? Having been born and raised, how long had you been in Scotland, having been born and raised in Poland, before you caught yourself using the word "we" without even noticing?
Well, do you know what? My first job was on the phone. I was working in a hotel, and I still remember the first conversation with a lovely old lady from Highland.
Yeah.
And after 10 minutes of trying to understand what she's trying to tell me, I just passed on the phone to my boss saying, "Look, either I'm gonna get a mental breakdown, or she's not gonna purchase what she wants to purchase." So
you learned.
I had to cut up quickly. So
yes, if you can't beat them, join them. Just the way you slipped, you didn't even notice you were doing it, which was lovely, really, because it's a simulation. Isn't it? It's an absolute moment of integration. Chris, thank you. David's in Romford. David, what would you like to say? Oh, I think something's happened to David's phone since he spoke to the producer, which means that I won't have anybody waiting on the next line for about 30 seconds. There it is. Jay's in Guildford. Jay, what would you like to say?
Hey, good morning. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. This is a terrible idea.
Go on.
It will give the Russians an excuse to make an attack on mainland Britain. Whether or not that happens or not is another debate.
They've already got an excuse to make an attack. This will be the point that Chris just made. The support that we've given is already fairly immense. Not as much as some other countries. Boris Johnson tried to turn it into a PR exercise for how much he was helping them. So why would this?
Boris Johnson's a clown. So,
yeah, but that doesn't change the fact that he was very, very affectionately regarded by the Ukrainian people because of the perception that he was giving huge amounts of help to Ukraine. So why would this change?
I think can we both agree that there are nuances in war?
Well, of course we can. But that's the question. So, the question is nuanced. Why would the levels of support currently offered not justify an attack upon British soil, but the ramping up of support up to and including long-range missiles suddenly would?
Because at the moment we're effectively fighting a proxy war.
Yes.
We are not actually attacking Russians on home territory.
Well, they are. Just not with long-range missiles. They're doing it with guns and drones.
Right, but again, there is a massive difference between me taking a rifle and taking pot shots at Russian soldiers and me using a highly advanced weapon system.
Why?
Which we've already been accused of not allowing, of having our own operators using it already. And Putin has said that actually this is an advanced weapon system, and you physically can't train the Ukrainians in the time that you've allowed it to happen.
And I don't know. I mean, you've got military experience, and I haven't. I don't know if that's true. I don't know whether or not you will need British people on the ground, covert or overt.
On that, shall we?
No, I
was in Kosovo.
Go on.
We were the ones protected the Russians from the Americans. The Americans are not our friends here.
Right.
We were the ones. Mike Jackson surrounded the Russians with a British enclave. He put us right in the middle he put the Russians right in the middle
we're
of the
drifting
British.
a little bit off the question of whether or not Vladimir Putin's advancing invading force should be resisted with long-range missiles built in Britain. So, apart from the answer apart from the answer, if we do that, Britain becomes a target. I mean, I'd remind you of Alexander Litvinchenko. I'd remind you of the attempted murder of the Skripals in Salisbury. I don't think that the UK is currently a place where Vladimir Putin is wary of trying to kill people.
No,
So there have already been attacks on British soil.
But again, there are nuances, aren't there?
You keep saying that.
Litvinenko was an isolated attack on him.
Yes.
The Salisbury attack, people unfortunately got involved in that, but it wasn't targeted at the British population in general.
So that's what you're saying. You're saying what would essentially be a terror attack on British soil, sponsored by the Kremlin, would be a consequence of firing long-range missiles into Russia.
I think it would go beyond a terrorist attack.
So it'd be an act of war.
Same thing. We are doing the same thing in Russia. Don't forget that, we hear it, this is terrible, 182 metres.
Yeah, you're doing it again. I'm just going to drag you back to the simple question of long-range missiles going into Russia from Ukraine, which Russia invaded. And let me remind you that long-range missiles are routinely being fired into Ukraine by Russia.
Yep. No, I completely
So with your
agree.
military training, if you are being attacked with a certain type of weapon and told that you're not allowed to retaliate in kind, how would you feel?
I mean, this is the inequalities of war, isn't it?
No, I'm asking how you would feel.
And what I would say, I'm on the British side, so I'm here with my nice advanced weapons. Should we pity the Ukrainians?
Let me repeat the question, that you are being attacked with a certain type of weapon while being told that you are not allowed to retaliate with the same type of weapon.
Yeah.
And if you want to use the phrase inequality of war, what's the best solution to inequality?
Is the solution...
It's not a trick question. What's the best solution to inequality? What's the solution to inequality? What's the opposite, Jay, of inequality?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I understand.
Well, say it out loud in case people aren't keeping up. What?
Quality, I agree that yes.
Well, say the word.
It would be nice if they were equality.
Right, so in the context of long-range missiles, what does equality look like?
Well, for the Ukrainians, it looks like they would be allowed to use our very advanced weapon systems.
And the reason why they shouldn't is because Vladimir Putin might try to invade the United Kingdom or launch...
He's not going to invade. Don't be silly, James. Come on.
But you're the one talking about acts... You're the one talking about... So what sort of attack are you talking about then?
Massive infrastructure attacks. They regularly probe our skies. These are very, very dangerous. The RAF do a great job of protecting us and making sure that they do this. What happens if one day it goes a little bit too far and they take out one of our fighters? What happens if a conflict at sea rather than a standoff? The Royal Navy are now forced to engage.
And at what point do we stand up to Putin then?
I think we're standing up to him nicely now. I think there is a very, very tight, nuanced thing about allowing our missiles to attack mainland Russia.
No, it's an important point to be made, and I'm glad that you made it. Chemical weapons, we let him use chemical weapons on UK soil, but don't greenlight the retaliation that Ukraine wants. Russia can target the Ukraine energy system, but Ukraine can't do anything to upset Russia. It's an interesting position, but I suspect one that would receive a much warmer reception in the Kremlin than it would almost anywhere else in the world. It's 11:34. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11:37 is the time. It may seem a little odd given the seriousness of the conversation that we're having, but we're about to indulge in a little bit of silliness. My thanks to Jane for noticing this. I wish I had, to be honest with you, for two reasons. Number one, it's a very astute observation. And number two, I think we can bring Smear Keir out of retirement. I know what you're thinking. Smear Keir's only been retired for about a fortnight. Is it a fortnight yet? Possibly less than a fortnight. So we put Smear Keir into the... Smear Keir was a little jingle we used to play when pointing out stories that were so obnoxiously patronising to readers or listeners, so obviously untrue that anybody presenting them to you as a genuine story or as the truth was, frankly, borderline corrupt when it comes to the relationship with basic honesty and, of course, respect for the listener or the reader. There was so much of it in the run-up to the general election, but we felt after the general election that it had run its course. But of course, you can do retrospective checks on smear Keir. So Jane points out one of the biggest smears of Keir was the suggestion that Keir Starmer would never work on Fridays. The Conservative Party said he would clock off work at 6 p.m. if he becomes Prime Minister. Maria Caulfield used a Sky News interview to lie by claiming that he would want to work a 4-day week. You forget just how awful they were, don't you? Well, I do sometimes. You maybe don't. Of course, the reason was that he would try to reserve Friday evenings to spend with his family. His wife is Jewish. Friday night dinner is a big part of the calendar for many Jewish families, and he would do that. He would try to reserve Friday evenings to spend with his family unless it was absolutely urgent or for a special reason. He simply said, we've had a structure in place that I tried to keep to, which is to carve out our really protected time for the kids. Jane messages me to say, wait, what? The Prime Minister is meeting with the President of the United States on a Friday evening, James? He is, capital letters, working on a Friday evening? Didn't certain corners of the media slate him earlier this year for saying he would mainly spend Friday evenings with his family? More than that. Maria Caulfield said he'd be working a 4-day week. So a nice little remark. Should we dust it off, Keith? Can I dust? Do I have to blow the dust off it myself? I have to. Okay, hang on. Don't adjust your radios. Reduced not quite by 10% yet, Simon, but it's certainly coming down. Back to the question of what happens and whether we should agree to allow Ukraine to use British-manufactured missiles and to strike deep inside Russia. A reasonable objection, I think, with the last call before the news that it may prompt Vladimir Putin to launch even more attacks on British soil and to do real attacks rather than just sort of propaganda destabilisations like aiding and abetting with Brexit or various other UK damaging phenomena that many British voters have been persuaded were actually a good idea. David's in Romford. David, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Good morning. I want to keep this short and sweet because I'm grafting, right? I'm speaking on behalf of the young individuals, particularly my age.
Yeah.
Because we pretty much all have the same sort of views regarding this situation that's going on.
Right.
I do agree that USA should allow Ukraine to use UK weapons. The reason why I say USA because they're going to have the last say.
Yeah, I think so, yes.
If Keir Starmer agreed to use it or not.
Yes.
So I do believe that it should be used against Russia. The reason why is because Putin is simply bullying everybody.
Yes.
He's bullying everyone, and something needs to be put an end to it. Otherwise, this is going to be going on for X amount of years.
Well, I mean, what about Jay's suggestion that if we do this, he will bully us even more? He will ramp up the bullying of Britain or of the United Kingdom, and do things that he hasn't already done, like go beyond chemical weapons attacks and beyond cyber attacks and beyond huge sponsored propaganda wars that we had a brilliant guest about yesterday. I don't know quite what it would look like, but it would be worse than what's already happening.
Then so be it. This has been going on for years. Putin's been absolutely threatening, doing what he's got to do to the UK, whatever. He's been doing this for years. So whatever's going to happen with the repercussions is going to happen. We all live in the UK. We all chose to live here. It's down to us.
What is the point of alliances if you don't step up? And I mean, some people would think we've not done enough so far, that the West hasn't helped enough. And that fundamental imbalance, whether you want to call it the inequality of war or a war crime, launching missiles into a country that is prevented by international diplomacy from launching similar missiles back when you're the one being invaded. I mean, yeah, David, neatly put, and you did indeed keep it short and sweet. 11:42 is the time. This is from Nikos. James, you are a Ukrainian propagandist and a scripted broadcaster. You are a government asset. This is why we prefer social media. Oh, mate. Oh, that's so sweet, isn't it? This is why we prefer social media, where we can choose what the truth is and what the facts are and what reality looks like. There is more free speech there. There you go. Thank you, Nikos. Thanks for getting in touch. Don't let me keep you away from your YouTube rabbit holes unduly. Seriously, those rabbits need feeding. 11:42 is the time. Helder is in Enfield. Helder, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
we speak again.
We do.
James, it's about time that we give the Ukrainians everything, and I mean everything they need to finish this war. Okay.
Why?
As you know, it's expanding.
Yes.
Now, the Iranians are supplying missiles. The Chinese have known to be involved as well. And if we don't stop it now, it's going to escalate to the point that it can't be stopped anymore. So now is the time to give them everything they need to finish it off once and for all.
How feasible is what you've just described, finishing? I mean, launching attacks on Russia to such a degree that it becomes Putin the choice between a rock and a hard place that Putin faces. He chooses the hard place of retreat as opposed to the rock of continuing war.
Because the example has already been given to us, ironically, by a Russian. When Prigozhin launched his march on Moscow, he almost triggered the collapse of the Putin government. There are rumors that he holed himself up in a secure dacha somewhere miles away from Moscow. So if the Ukrainians were to hit them at strategic points and then launch what's called in the trade a thunder run on Moscow, it would collapse the whole house of cards, and it needs to be done.
Prigozhin, for people not entirely clear, was the leader of the Wagner. How do you pronounce it? Wagner?
Wagner.
You do Wagner. I always pronounce it like the composer. I always want to say Wagner. Anyway, the leader of the sort of private military company, close confidant of Vladimir Putin until he launched a rebellion. It was a de facto rebellion in June of last year. And that's the question, isn't it? Do we know for sure how close that came to success? Do we know for sure how precarious Putin's position is in the face of certain threats, certain assaults?
From all the reports I've read online, and I try to keep my sources pretty good,
sure.
It was close. It was very, very close, to the point that even the population didn't rise up against the Wagner group. They went with it. So it's there to be taken. But we need to have the courage to do it.
How much of the thinking in the White House today is, do you think, prompted by fears of who might be there next year?
Exactly that, James. I've listened to your show yesterday, and everything that I personally follow quite closely, because
sure.
ex-NATO soldier and all that.
Yeah. And all that. Yes.
Yeah, the efforts that have been put into destabilising both the UK and the US from within. We've been at war for years. It's just been covered.
And people like Carol Cadwallader tried to point it out and were treated abominably by many members of this profession, and of course up to and including Andrew Neil, who never apologised for calling her a crazy cat lady. Just a bit of a pet subject of mine, that, because of the abuses that Carol was exposed to. Helder, thank you. A former NATO soldier looking essentially at the inevitability, or not the inevitability, the lack of alternatives, a sort of escalation into a form of endless war, or a genuine attempt to cut Putin off in his proverbial prime. And if you weren't listening to yesterday's show, he is referencing an interview I did with a brilliant journalist, works for Wired.com, called David Gilbert, who talked us through the new Department of Justice documents, the recently released Department of Justice documents that show how Russia is using US and almost certainly UK politicians to help craft their disinformation narratives before then deploying useful idiots, some of whom are actually paid, whether they realise where the money is coming from or not, to seed messages in the minds of the British public. And perhaps the most extreme example David provided was the way in which the same, quotes, useful idiots, end quotes, will seed messages that make situations like the riots worse. Which reminds me that I think Nigel Farage is on with Nick Ferrari next week.
James O'Brien on LBC.
7:49 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the conversation about various elements of the escalation of the Ukraine war. President Putin's warning that Britain and the US will be at war with Russia if they allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles to strike targets across the border. But it's a little bit harder to pin down precisely what that might mean. Professor Anthony King is a professor of defence and security studies at the University of Exeter, author of the book Urban Warfare in the 21st Century, and a proven helpful guide to these sort of matters for us on numerous occasions over the last couple of years. I mean, let's look at that. Will we be at war with Russia in the event of these British-made missiles being deployed by Ukraine?
I don't think so. But at the same time, if we look at the last 2 years, 2.5 years, the fact is that in response to the Western support for Ukraine, which almost everyone, and I would include myself absolutely in this, is absolutely vital. The fact is that Russia have, in the margins, pressurised Western countries with cyber attacks, and actually over the last summer, since last summer, a series of sabotage attacks on railroads and also shops with arson attacks. So I don't think, this is a rhetorical device. I don't think it's a real announcement of World War III. But we should recognise, even if we agree to the extension of these missiles, which seems militarily sensible,
right.
We've got to recognise the strategic implications, which is there is likely to be two retaliations. One, on Ukraine itself.
Yeah.
I think there'll be much more strategic bombardment on their cities and civilian infrastructure. And secondly, I think it's very likely that Russia will ramp up the kind of cyber sabotage attacks that we've seen with increasing frequency over the last 12 months.
What sort of thing are you referring to in the second example?
So in the second case, these are all slightly shadowy, that
Sure.
no one has absolutely definitively attributed various attacks. But there's an attack on the German Deutsche Bahn by the Russians in October 2022. Since last summer, there's been a series of very suspicious arson attacks on various shopping centres in the Baltics, and also, although there's other reasons have been attributed, a couple of arsons on munition sites, both in the UK and in the US, producing weaponry, munitions for Ukraine. Now, various people say, they were just accidents. That may be the case, but there's a widespread suspicion that quite a lot of these attacks have been, if not coordinated well, at least provoked by some kind of Russian activity. So what I would suggest is I don't think we're certainly not looking at World War III. And of course, Putin, every single time the West has offered new forms of weaponry, Putin has said, right, this is a red line, we're now at war. So we need to not be cowardly, but also, and this is where the whole visit with Antony Blinken and David Lammy comes in, this is a serious strategic calculation, which needs to be made, and we need to be aware of that.
What will it mean on the ground? I mean, how big a gear change is it actually, do you think?
In my humble opinion, I don't think it's a game changer. If we look back, even when I've been talking to you back in 2022, the delivery of HIMARS rockets, then the delivery of various other forms of weapon system, the F-16, it's not going to absolutely change the war. No single weapon ever does. What I think may mean that it puts the Russians under a significant level of pressure where they begin to think about a peace deal. But here's the thing. That peace deal is not going to involve, they're not going to withdraw from Ukraine. So we get to a horrible position where the best that we could say about the delivery of these weapons is they'll inflict some military pressure on Russia. They will concede a little bit. But the Zelensky government, Ukraine, I think, also will have to recognise the reality of the situation on the ground. Militarily, it's going to be very difficult, almost impossible, to expel this aggressive Russian invasion of their country. It just seems militarily impossible to set that back.
And although nothing is ever cast in stone in these matters, Zelensky has gone as far as he can to establish the impossibility of him ever agreeing to anything like that.
100%. So, I mean, in a certain sense, his, outstanding. I mean, we can only look with, impressiveness and awe on his performance. His presidency during the war has been based on the very reasonable presupposition that Ukraine is a sovereign territory. We all agree. Legally, it should be reintegrated entirely. Totally understandable. And in terms of uniting the various factions within Ukraine, it's absolutely essential that everyone is linked to that mission. The trouble is, the reality is, do the Ukrainians have enough forces to actually expel 400,000 Russian troops who are determined to hold bits of Ukraine? From an analytical point of view, we can talk politics, but from an analytical point of view, I think that's going to be hard.
So how does it end?
What do I think? How do I think it ends?
Yeah. I've asked you before. I'll ask you again.
And my answer hasn't changed really in about 2 years. So forgive me. How do I think it will end? I think these missiles will be delivered. I think they will put military pressure on the Russians, but the Russians will continue to advance. However, I think the Russians will work out that they're not going to take much more territory. I think Ukraine will ultimately work out at the end of this year they're not going to take back much more territory. I think we'll fight through into next summer, and then I think somehow there'll be some kind of unsatisfactory for all sides peace deal, and certainly unsatisfactory for the Ukrainians and for President Zelensky. But this is the reality of realpolitik, of military action. So that's where I see a longer, drawn-out war and probably a quite unsatisfactory conclusion in which Ukraine is separated. I mean, it's a horrible thing to say. I know loads of people disagree with me, but that's where I'd be.
And speaking of people who disagree with you, if we had ears on the conversation in the Oval Office today, either the conversation between Keir Starmer and President Biden or the conversations between Antony Blinken and David Lammy, do you think they would acknowledge that this is the likely denouement, or would they still be thinking or speaking in terms of a Ukrainian victory or Ukrainian success?
Well, let me say, I think that what the Ukrainians have done already is a relative victory.
Win. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's a win. But I also think that I take my viewpoint from my own point and from listening, to what is said from the White House. If we go back to November 2022, Mark Milley, then the chief of the Joint Staff, actually said, look, Ukraine, you're not going to win this war completely. Take a negotiation now. So my inferences from the Pentagon and from the White House statements is that the White House and the Pentagon want Ukraine to win without starting World War III, and to win in a realistic way, to have an outcome that's realistic rather than entirely utopian. And my own interpretation is that the White House and the Pentagon, in particular under the Biden administration, thinks a complete reintegration of Ukraine is pretty much illusory. But the Russians, they are an aggressive force. They will not be deterred. They have to be stopped militarily, and the question is where that line is. So I would hope and think that the kind of realistic, maybe pragmatic, sceptical view that I would articulate, I don't think it's miles off where the Biden administration is. I think probably also the British administration as well.
Professor Anthony King, many thanks. Anthony, of course, Professor of Defence and Security Studies at the University of Exeter. And as he says, other analyses are available, but I always like hearing his. He manages to cut through quite a lot of the chaff, doesn't he? He's also the author of a book called Urban Warfare in the 21st Century. There's a couple of messages that almost sum up the dichotomy here or the difference here. What if the man you're talking to is being over-optimistic, James, or wrong? Did you see Putin on TV this morning? He looked deadly serious. He always looks deadly serious. I think it's the surgery, isn't it? If not plastic surgery, then Botox. I think if he smiled, his cheeks would crack, like some sort of television presenters that you see occasionally knocking around. But I shouldn't jest. You are right. He does seem to be deadly serious, but I thought Anthony made a fairly good case for pointing out that he's said all this before. Ash, on the other side of the scale, says Putin is the most dangerous dictator since Adolf Hitler. Had we continued to appease the Nazis in 1939, we would all be speaking German now, and there would possibly be no Jewish people left in the world. We're putting off the inevitable when we dither about supplying Ukraine with the weapons that they need to win, not just to maintain a bloody stalemate. We need to show Putin that he has a limit to his leash. And, it's a bit uncharacteristic of me, but I can see both of those points, actually. What you want to happen must never be allowed to influence what you honestly think will or might happen, and that's why I'm grateful to everybody who's contributed to this part of the programme. My apologies to Gabriel and Alfred, Alistair and Howard, Keith, Nick, Paul, who we won't have time to hear from today because we're moving on to something new in the next hour, although I am left with that abiding question of why don't women ring on these subjects, at least as much as most of the men do.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 12. I'm a bit torn. This is a little odd. There's two stories I've got in front of me, one of which is going to inform the bulk of the next hour's conversation, although there are a few things I need to bring to your attention as well, and a bit of an unexpected treat coming up for fans of for people who enjoy the same kind of comedy that I enjoy. And they're both, one is a really tricky question, and it brings us back to one of the biggest scandals that beset the last Conservative government in its dying days. The news that, do you remember the racist businessman Frank Hester? the one that had said that Diane Abbott made him want to hate all black women, and he said that Diane Abbott should be shot. I think her memoir is out today. Do you know why she broke up with Jeremy Corbyn? It's a lovely story. I don't think either of them emerged from it particularly badly. And in fact, I'm not sure, if you don't know the answer to the question, I will share it with you. I don't know that anyone's going to change their opinion of either party when they find out the reason why the relatively brief romance between Diane Abbott and Jeremy Corbyn came to an end. I found it quite endearing, actually, for both of them, which is, I don't know, maybe I'm getting a bit soppy in my old age. But Diane Abbott, by far the most maligned and abused member of Parliament ever, probably. I mean, the social media and much of the traditional media didn't exist in previous centuries, in previous ages. So, I think you could say with some confidence that no member of Parliament has ever been as viciously abused and as repeatedly attacked as Diane Abbott, which would make you think that having a major donor joining in the racist abuse of Diane Abbott would make him anathema. What's the word? What's the sort of untouchable? What's the word I want for someone who's untouchable? But maybe it's just untouchable. I've got to stop asking you what word it is that I'm searching for. It's my job to come up with the words. It would make him untouchable. You'd think, wouldn't you? Well, he's given another £5 million to the Tory party. That's on top of what we already knew about. This is new. Just before the election. So all of that scandal, all of that outrage, I think, didn't Kemi Badenoch actually do the right thing? And yet there's another £5 million they've taken from him. So I, at the very deep end of the time that we spend together, I find myself wondering how anybody of colour could vote for the Conservative Party. There's a really curious dichotomy here, isn't there? Because you've got Kemi Badenoch and James Cleverly running for the leadership, which is objectively great. It's wonderful to see inclusion, diversity, call it what you will, in the upper echelons of the Conservative Party. But it is a party that is prepared to... It's a party funded by racists, or at least largely funded by this racist. I think you're right. The word I was looking for was pariah. Yeah, I'm not going to stop asking for your help because you're so good at it. Persona non grata is good, but pariah, I think, is the better. You'd have thought, wouldn't you? Having said, what do you have to say in order for your money to become too dirty for the Tory party to touch? So I'm conscious of, as ever, of my white privilege. But how could anybody vote for? How could anybody? Well, I mean, in many ways, why am I even confining the conversation to people of colour, to black people in particular? Why would I? How could anyone vote for a party that is bankrolled by a racist? But I presume it becomes a particular problem if you are actually black yourself. So that's the question I've got for you at the deep end. The question I've got at the shallow end is an altogether different one. There's a billionaire who has just gone to space. I don't know if you've seen this story. You must have seen this story. He has paid, I presume, a ton of money in order to go to space. And I don't really get it. I don't think... sometimes I start talking about something I thought I was interested in, and I realise almost immediately that it's not as interesting as I thought it was. A question of if you were a billionaire, would you pay to go to space? It's not going to open up a brilliant phone in, is it? It's not going to open up unvisited, previously unsuspected avenues of interest and conversation. I don't think it is anyway. I just thought it was a remarkable story, and there's a little moral dimension to it as well. But I don't want to have another conversation about wealth distribution and the question of how much wealth is too much wealth. So we'll go back to this. How much wealth is? What would you spend your money on? Bankrolling the Tory party or going on a spacewalk? Who'd have thought that there was actually a way of knitting these two stories together? I didn't think there was when I started talking about them 6 minutes ago, but there it is. I hate asking you how big a deal something is. But this story really sticks in my craw. It has done since it broke. I remember thinking, and I don't like being wrong, although I'm now capable of admitting it in a way that I wasn't as a younger man. I thought that they would cut ties with him. I really did. I thought that the investigation was so comprehensive and the evidence so powerful that there was no earthly way Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party, or indeed anybody's Conservative Party, would have been able to sustain relations with a man who had engaged in such vile bigotry. Diane Abbott makes you, quote, want to hate all black women and should be shot. Should be shot. There was an attempted apology, which kind of denied any racism, so it wasn't worth the paper that it was printed on. And you presumed that this would be an act too far, that this would be a non-negotiable, didn't you? I did. Maybe I'm naive, maybe you think I'm stupid. I just thought, I mean, what would be other examples where donors, I can't think off the top of my head, but how bad would an intervention from a donor, potential or actual, have to be for the party to say, sorry, we don't want your money anymore? And then it emerged that there was another £5 million in the pipeline, and they were going to keep it. And you sort of found yourself thinking, wow, they are. What words am I looking for? They are untroubled enough. They are comfortable enough with his racism to take his money. I don't know whether I'm misremembering what Kemi Badenoch did, because it wasn't long before she was dismissing the row as trivia. Someone calling for, I mean, I don't know whether she'd agree that someone calling for her to be shot because she's black would be trivia, but if, for the record, if that were to happen, I would be speaking about Kemi Badenoch in exactly the same terms that I'm talking about Diane Abbott today. If a Labour Party donor were found to have given money to the Labour Party while saying that Kemi Badenoch made him want to hate all black women and should be shot, and then a Labour politician popped up and said, oh, this is just trivia. Oh, good Lord. I know not what I do. There would be such things. I can't get my head around this kind of behaviour from politicians. So how can I just don't understand, because that £5 million that was in the pipeline came through, and then it was reported, I think yesterday, that they took another £5 million from him. So you've got the original 10, right, £1 million. You've got the 5 that was pending. I don't know if you get that on your online banking, and you have to don't look at the balance, look at the pending. Look at what the balance will be when the pendings come out. So you had £5 million pending, and they took that. And then it's emerged that they took another £5 million from him just before the election, from his company, Phoenix Partnership, which meant he gave the Tory party £20 million in total, and they're keeping it all despite the fact that he engaged in some hideous racist and misogynistic abuse. So I return to that observation of a few moments ago when I don't like asking you how big a deal is this, for two reasons. It makes me sound lazy, and it doesn't usually prompt very interesting calls. So the more laser-like the focus of my question is, the easier it is for you to ring in with brilliant contributions, because I've already done some of the work for you. The more broad you'd think, wouldn't you? If your job is to canvass phone calls, then the wider the goalposts, the easier your job becomes. But if you see your job as canvassing interesting contributions rather than just contributions, then actually the opposite is true. The more narrow the goalposts are, the more interesting your answers will be, because you've had to do some bloody thinking before you ring in. So that's why I don't like the question, how big a deal do you think this is? And I'm not going to ask it. I want to know how anyone can vote for the Conservative Party when they know that it's bankrolled by a racist. 0345 6060 973. I don't know that I want to go in on the ethnicity of Kemi Badenoch and James Cleverly first up. How can you run to lead a party that's bankrolled by a racist when you're black? He's not just a donor. He is arguably Well, he's not even arguably the biggest donor. He is the biggest donor. Did Rishi Sunak offer up a defence that if they didn't take his money, they wouldn't be able to fight the general election? Or I might be imagining that. The Conservative Party, in its current form, is bankrolled almost entirely by a massive racist, a man who has called for an MP to be shot dead because she is a black woman. This is what I mean about gaslighting. I mean, hear those words come out of my mouth. The Conservative Party, in its current form, is being bankrolled by a man who called for an MP, an elected serving member of Parliament, to be shot dead because she's a black woman. That's what he wanted to see. I don't think he was inciting, for the record. I don't think he was actually encouraging people to do it. He was merely sharing his dreams in the same way that Suella Braverman used to dream of. No, she did want that to happen. I don't think Frank Hester wanted Diane Abbott dead, but he said she should be shot, essentially for being black. She makes him want to hate all black women. I hate it when this happens. I hate it when I realise, only in the moment of talking to you, how extraordinary the damage that's been done to our country in recent years really is. I'm confident that this would not have been tolerated under previous administrations. I'm confident that previous iterations of the Tory party, you might think I'm a naive, trusting fool, but I don't think the Conservative Party of Michael Heseltine or Dominic Grieve, I don't think they'd have put up with this. I don't think the membership, I don't think the parliamentary membership would have stood it. We cannot possibly take money from this man anymore. This is absolutely obscene racism. Racism in its purest, most hideous form. She makes me want to hate all black women. But they took the money, they kept the money, and just before the general election, they took £5 million more. So how can any person who cares about racism, but that, again, possibly casts the net too wide, how can any black person vote for the party that is bankrolled by a racist? 0345 6060 973. Manisha points out, James, from Harrow, this is not your usual light-hearted final hour of our week together. You're not wrong, actually. And that's why I was looking at the story about the billionaire floating through space. But this is hugely important. And I don't know. I sometimes bore myself with my constant references to how bent my own profession has become. How can this be allowed? How can we be even having a conversation about the party of opposition being bankrolled by a racist? Bankrolled by a racist. Police investigation is continuing. There's a woman in court today for carrying a banner which had pictures of coconuts on it alongside two prominent politicians. I could say no more about that because it is in magistrate's court today. Police investigation into a man who said that Diane Abbott should, get the words exactly right, Diane Abbott should be shot, and that she makes him want to hate all black women. Police investigation is continuing. Look, mate, I tell you what, I'd welcome if you've got a cold compress that you can apply to my furrowed brow and tell me why this is all a storm in a teacup and I shouldn't be worried about it at all. Perhaps you could explain Kemi Badenoch's thinking when she describes it as trivia, while insisting that the Conservative Party should not return the businessman's £10 million donation. She was the first to describe the comments as racist, but then said we should keep the money. So she's a really good example of what I'm describing. How can you stand to lead a party that's bankrolled by a racist, particularly perhaps if you're black? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Laura in Renfrew makes a point that I don't often put on the programme because it's a little close to whataboutery. But can you imagine for a minute if this was the Labour Party? What the almost monopolistic print media, right-wing monopoly almost on print media, what they would be doing at the moment? Could you imagine if a Labour donor was found to have described Kemi Badenoch in these terms? Would he have been allowed to waltz away? Would he have been allowed to continue? Would they have continued to take his money? Hit the numbers now, you will get through. It's 12:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Clive asks a question, I think in jest, although I'm not sure, to be honest. Does it depend on the size of your donation to the Conservative Party on how racist you can be? Allow me to rewrite that for you, Clive, if I may. Does the size of your donation to the Conservative Party determine how racist you can be? I think it probably does, actually. I think that if Frank Hester had donated £500,000, they probably would have told him to sling his hook. But he donated £10 million. So when he turned out to be a massive racist, they took 10 million more from him. And I'm going to add another question to the list, if I may, because this is one of the few outposts of popular media in the United Kingdom that actually understands the meaning of the phrase white privilege. Is this an inappropriate question for me to be asking? How could a black person vote for a party that's bankrolled by a racist? I mean that. It might be a bit meta, but I'd be interested in your answer. 21 after 12 is the time. Imis Yalua is in Fulham. What do you want to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
How are you?
Very well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
How's
Actually,
your
I'm
mum?
going to answer. She's good. She says hi.
Glad to hear it. Why doesn't she ring me anymore?
I don't know, actually.
No.
I'll tell her off.
Okay, carry on. It's the new generation. It's the new generation.
What can you do? I'm going to answer the question that you just asked now, if that's okay, in a sentence. I don't know if it's the wrong question, but I think there are things you're just never going to understand.
For sure.
So I think I'm like, kudos to you for actually realising that and actually picking up on the fact that actually is this the kind of question that I can ask. I think you have to understand that the way kind of like black people live their lives,
yes,
racism is a day-to-day thing.
Of course.
So you have to pick your poison. If you, for example, have decided that, you know what, their policies, aside from the racism, are best for me, people are going to vote for them. Because, you know, the same way that some people say, I don't like immigrants, but not you. You're different. You're my friend.
I don't mean you. I don't mean you.
Exactly. So sometimes black people say it to themselves. Oh, okay, cool. You're talking about Diana, but you're not talking about me. If I was in a room, you would like me. You would prefer me. You would do business with me. You would talk to me. You wouldn't do business with her. That's the first point. The second point is you also have to get to a point where you think, okay, what is the best way forward? If the best way forward for me is voting for Conservative policies, or if I think I'm the kind of black person that should vote for Conservative policies, I'm going to vote for them. That's it. Like, I'm no longer going to think about, what should black people do? You'd consider yourself that, I'm not a monolith. We're not monoliths. We all think differently.
Of course.
So if that works for me, I'm going to vote for it. You may not tell your friends you're going to vote for it. You may be a bit secretive about who you tell you're going to vote for it, but you're going to vote for it. I think sometimes, especially with black people, there's this danger of thinking that everybody thinks the same way, like I said, and it's not true.
Well, clearly it's not true, because there are two black people running for the leadership of the Conservative Party, despite the fact that it's bankrolled by a racist. So they would be the best possible proof of your point. It's just, this is the party that is representative of the values that I hold and the policies that I want to see enacted. But it's a big but. But it's currently bankrolled by a massive racist.
It is a but people.
So let me ask you this: you make a brilliant point, and I understand it. I may not entirely agree with it, but as you say, there are things about blackness that I will never understand. Would the black person voting for the Conservatives, be less troubled by Frank Hester style racism than other black people? I'd take you to the point where Kemi Badenoch can, and this I don't get, describe it as trivia. The man said that Diane Abbott should be shot. Yeah. So would it be that they are less troubled by this sort of racism? I
don't think you're less troubled by it. You just have to put it in a box. Because if Kemi Badenoch had stood up and said, that is probably one of the worst things I've ever heard in politics and I can't believe it, she didn't have to question why she's still part of that party. Yeah. But if you make something smaller and you put it in a box and you say, well, actually, people hear things like this all the time, and actually, I work in a workspace where my line manager is racist, or my boss is racist, or the people around me are racist, so actually, it's not that bad.
Right. Well, she didn't do that. She said we need to get to a place where we stop chasing people around and looking everywhere for the racism, in response to a story about a man saying that Diane Abbott makes him want to hate all black women, and that as a consequence of being a black woman, she should be shot.
But that's what she did do. She made it smaller. She's like, rather than it being this big thing, it's just this small thing. Stop looking for it everywhere. If you don't look for it, do you remember when Donald Trump was like, the only reason that we're finding COVID cases is because we're actually testing for them? It's like that. If you stop looking for it, you'll stop finding it. Rather than it being that this is a daily occurrence that we find. If you stop looking, if you stop grabbing onto everything, we'll all be fine.
So if we stop looking for problems, we can all pretend there aren't any.
Exactly.
Good Lord.
Exactly. And it's tough. It's really tough. I think for me, when I heard it, I just remember thinking, like, I wasn't surprised. I know when you first spoke about it on the radio, you were surprised. I wasn't surprised.
Well, no, hang on a minute. I wasn't surprised that people like this and opinions like this exist. I was surprised they kept the money. I was surprised they kept him on side. But I honestly don't think they would have done had it been a much smaller sum of money, which in many ways makes it even worse, not better.
Yeah. No, they're not. Then they were never going to give it back. They were going to do the whole...
This was the chairman of a constituency Conservative party in the home counties. They'd have been thrown out of the party.
Absolutely, but they were never going to give it back. It's too much money.
Yeah, so that is, I mean, it comes down to whether Clive was being tongue-in-cheek or not. It really does come down to the amount of racism you can get away with as a Conservative Party donor depends on how much you've donated.
Yeah, but then that's also like, in the workplace, how many times have I heard of people getting away with crazy things? Yeah. The higher up they are. If you've just come in, no, that's fine, you're expendable. But if you've been there for 20 years and you're bringing in clients and you're this and you're that and you have massive titles, suddenly it becomes okay.
So, can I use the word sanguine to describe your attitude, or would that be unfair?
I don't think that's unfair.
No, I don't either. And you're
and
right.
It's quite sad.
Well, it is quite sad, and yet it is your lived experience, and you sit with the sadness, whereas I can sit here in a slightly, perhaps potentially patronising way, railing against it.
Yeah, but it's. I mean, like you said, it's the privilege that you have. So, for example, you get to talk about this on a radio station, and then you can leave it.
Yeah.
You can leave it.
And that's why it hit me so hard when I was redoing the introduction, because I have left it for a long time and I couldn't quite believe what it brought back, whereas you live with it.
Yeah, I can tell you stories that would curl your hair. Honestly, turn your hair grey.
No, too late. Grey. Too late.
Oh, you grey?
Well, no, my beard is. My hair is hanging in there, what's left of it. Thank you. You know I always enjoy talking to you, and I think everybody listening now knows why. It is 27 minutes after 12. However, it is just one opinion, and there is plenty of room for others. That notion of ignoring racism, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but it is clearly something that the Conservative Party relies on. I mean, if you are a black Conservative, delighted by the fact that James Cleverly and Kemi Badenoch are vying for the leadership of your party, how much is that joy polluted by the knowledge that the party is almost entirely bankrolled by a stone-cold textbook racist who, and let's get the quote exactly right, you just want to hate all black women because she's there. I can't get my head around that bigotry. Because it would, I'm trying to think of a white woman who I've politically got a huge problem with. It's got to be Nadine Dorries, I suppose, albeit that she's not a politician anymore. I suppose it's debatable whether she ever was, but technically she was. Imagine if I looked at Nadine Dorries and said she makes me want to hate all white women. The level of racism you must already have inside you to leap from looking at one woman to thinking that you hate all of them because she's white. It beggars belief. But it's given us an opportunity for Idiot's Corner. I've lost it now. I want to make sure I get the right one. I marvel at how anybody could say the things that Frank Hester said, but quite how anybody could listen to this programme and get in touch to say, how can you be calling him a racist for giving money to a party led by an Asian? Well, the reason I can call him a racist, mate, is because I've just read out the words that he said when he was being racist. I guess the effort you put into persuading yourself that you're not can sometimes be superhuman. It's 12:30. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 33 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Matt's taken issue with my suggestion that no one would look at Nadine Dorries and decide that they suddenly want to hate all white women. Frank Hester, the Tory party bankroller, looks at Diane Abbott and describes himself as wanting to hate all black women. Matt writes, Nadine Dorries actually made me want to hate all humans, James. I live in the woods now with the badgers. It's good that you've still got a radio there, Matt. Back to that conversation. Colin from Portsmouth is on the line.
Well, what have we here? Two British heavyweight titans meeting for the first time. Colin from Portsmouth and James O'Brien. Listen, I've been forced to listen to your pathetic woke nonsense, and let me tell you this, you make me sick. You are the epitome of the lefty, liberal, goo-pudding, ramekin-hoarding, metropolitan elite, sitting in your little ivory chair, speaking over brave, right-leaning callers so they're not allowed to tell the nation why Brexit was such a good idea. Crushing listeners' arguments, using their own logic against them. It's disgusting. You are what is wrong with this country. I bet you don't even care that the National Trust is becoming a Sharia kingdom that forces its poor, unsuspecting customers to have scones without any dairy products in. You might as well take your middle name out, yeah? Replace the O with Ules. James Ules Bryan. Because that is how much of an enemy you are to this country. I bet you're on a secret WhatsApp group with Carol Vorderman and Gary Bloody Lineker, aren't you? Plotting with Keir Starmer to get into the House of Lords and make it law to buy your book. Oh, you'd love that, wouldn't you? If we had to pay a licence to watch the BBC and to read your book, you're now the king of radio just because every single caller to your show since 2016 is too frightened to give you one positive of leaving the EU in case they're locked up for free speech. Well, I hope you're happy because you are destroying this once great country from the inside. Anyway, James, I've had a lovely time. Thank you so much for having me on. Love to the family.
Love to the family, Colin. I heard you're on tour at the moment. Are there any tickets still available?
Oh, you'd love that, wouldn't you? If you could come and ruin my tour at Leicester Square Theatre on 2nd of October and elsewhere around the country until October the 12th, I'm not having it. Not having it. But yeah, tickets are available on socomedy.co.uk.
Or, of course, you could just do a search on Exploding Heads, all one word. Love to the family, Colin. It's 12:36. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Do not adjust your radio. We return now to the question in hand, which is about the relationship between racism, money and the current Conservative Party, and the, I think, irresistible conclusion that it depends on how much money you give. Give 20 million quid, you can be as racist as you want. Give 20 quid, you'll probably get drummed out for saying exactly what Frank Hester said about Diane Abbott. David is in Bayswater. David, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi, James. I'll be as succinct as possible. So, very quickly, I think it's one of the factors is self-interest. I think that if you are, I'm a person of colour myself, but I don't vote Conservative. Okay. But I think if you vote Conservative, a lot of the times it's because it serves your financial interests and other, maybe and wider interests, social interests as well. Yes. But so you're just going to gaslight yourself into saying, oh, well, he's not that racist, or you'll just put it out of your mind. So, you know, and I think that's linked to tribal loyalty, that a lot of Conservatives of colour, they just will stick with the Conservatives, even if an individual as nefarious as this does bankroll the party.
So you think it may not have actually turned a single black voter away from the party?
It may have turned some away, but I think there's a number of people who will just stick with what they're used to. It would take something absolutely massive, like if he actually did something physical to her. I think that would.
Well, I mean, then his feet wouldn't touch the ground legally, would they? I mean, we don't need to.
Exactly, yeah. And I think people are capable of mental acrobatics. We all are, aren't we, James?
We certainly are.
Yeah. Yeah, and also very two more points I want to make.
Okay.
It's on a continuum of racism. If you look at the history of the Tory party, it has been a racist party in many ways. So this is just the logical end of it, isn't it? What he says is almost, it's been said before, but maybe not such brutal terms. You know what I mean?
Hang on, there was one more.
Yes, one more. Yeah, you may find this a bit difficult to take, but if you look at people voting for Starmer, he condoned the Palestinians being starved and not having water, but people still voted for him in the election. And
there is a difference. Not to be unduly defensive, because I thought what Starmer said was outrageous, but he did rescind it. He did row back from it.
He did
and
it
the Conservative Party
though,
have done nothing to row back from this.
But
they've taken another £5 million. Starmer is now calling for a ceasefire.
But I personally think he's disingenuous because
maybe.
he only did it under pressure. He didn't do it voluntarily. So I think in both parties you have this tribal loyalty and self-interest, which dictates how you're going to vote. So
except to defend non-Labour voters is that an awful lot of support was hemorrhaged by Starmer's stance on Gaza, which is why these independent candidates succeed. So you don't. That's why I ask about the possibility of a person of colour being turned away from the Tory party. But I don't think that support for the Palestinian cause is confined to people of Arab or Muslim heritage. So an awful lot of people who voted for these independent candidates who essentially went in as single-issue candidates at the last election, an awful lot of support they enjoyed would have been drawn from right across the population, the parts of the population that find the continuing carnage in Gaza and, of course, now in the West Bank, utterly intolerable, indefensible and quite probably criminal. It's 12:39. Thank you, David. Deborah is in Leon C. Deborah, what would you like to say?
Pretty much the same thing. It's a case of you can't eat morals, can you? So people will still vote for the Conservatives if they believe that their values and their policies will benefit them. And it's very easy to stand on moral ground, but not if. I mean, we now live in a society. Now live in times where people put their families and themselves before society, community, and even humanity. And another thing, obviously, Frank Hester referred to as a racist. He's also misogynist.
Yes, I did. I have mentioned that a couple of times, actually.
Yeah,
but you're absolutely right to remind us. Can't imagine him saying it about a black man. It makes me want to hate all black men. David Lammy makes me want to hate all black men. James Cleverly makes me want to hate all black men. It doesn't quite work, does it? I can't quite imagine it.
No, and as a person who's not of colour, as a white person, I don't have the enragement as people of colour would do over the racism marks. But as a woman, I have basically, Diane Abbott has had absolutely her whole career has been maligned so badly. If that was a man, that would never have happened to her, regardless of whether she's a woman of colour. She's a woman.
She is. I don't know. I hope it's not inappropriate to remind you that she did write that ludicrous letter to The Guardian claiming that being Jewish was similar to being ginger. But that is in no way a justification of or excuse for the levels of abuse and hatred that she has endured over decades.
Yes, I know, because I'd like to meet a perfect person. Nobody is perfect. We all have moments of insanity and say stupid crap. Sorry.
Well, there you go. You just proved it, Deborah. It's 12:41 is the time. I think that's allowed. She's allowed to say that, is she once? Did we keep it in? We didn't, yeah. Thank you, Deborah. John's in Sutton. John, what would you like to say?
Hello there, James. I was thinking on what you were saying about what is the name of this guy again?
Frank. He's called the racist businessman Frank Hester.
Thank you. The racist businessman Frank Hester. Yeah, I was just thinking about that, and I came up with a kind of, I suppose, an amateur psychologist theory. There's a term in psychology called trauma bonding, where children or someone, an individual or a group of individuals who are in the care or under the thrall of someone who's abusing them, they still bond with them, but it's called a trauma bond. Okay. And I think, in a sense, I was reflecting on what you were saying and why this racist gentleman's words seem so freely to flow from his mouth is because we've been living in a trauma bond under the Conservative government, in my view.
Yeah.
And, I think, trauma has been normalised. We've watched everything crumble and collapse, from the health service to, key workers' pay rates and, and a plethora.
Someone should write a book about it, John.
Yep. I'm sure. And I just think that now we're kind of coming out of that because we finally got a Labour government, and they're trying to actually fix problems rather than sweep them under the carpet and create more.
Yeah, albeit as the last caller pointed out, and as the last two callers pointed out, nobody's perfect, and Keir Starmer upset an awful lot of people very, very much with his first comments about the Israeli response to the October the 7th terror attacks last year.
Yeah.
Totally. So you see this, because I don't know really. You see it as culmination rather than aberration, I think.
Yeah, I just see it as it was the social norm, but also, 2 callers back, you had a a caller of colour who was talking about the fact that there probably will still be a lot of people who vote for the Conservatives, and I think that is trauma bonding. I think that is they are in a kind of a social bubble model of it rather than an individualistic model of it.
It's hard to say though to someone without being accused, without seeming condescending or patronising, isn't it? No, these are my genuine views. How dare you accuse me of being a victim of trauma bonding?
Yeah, absolutely, and I take that, and you're absolutely right. But it's just that this is my amateur psychologist armchair theory. But I just see that it's just. I think what really highlighted it for me was just when you listen to a lot of the news articles about what's going on here at home. Since the Labour government have taken over, you're hearing a lot more actions about doing things to sort things out.
Just an acknowledgement of reality as opposed to the ludicrous pretences before, probably dating back to Brexit, the nonsense about pretending something's good or going well, because the alternative is to admit that your entire project is built on absolute cheese.
Indeed, and everything they do is dysfunctional and toxic. You get so kind of... almost drowned by the toxicity of it, everything that is.
So how shocked were you listening to that? Because I mean, because you knew it all already. You may not have known that they've taken another £5 million from him in the immediate.
I heard all of that.
So you knew all of that, and yet when you hear it again, reassembled and regurgitated, does it smack? Does it land? Does it slap?
What does what?
Or does it hit you hard to hear it all again, or does it just sort of wash over you?
Sorry, what again?
That language, what he said, what he actually said, coupled with the fact that they take £20 million from him after it went public, they continued to take half of that sum.
Well, it's for me, it's twofold. It's what he said and it's what they're doing. It's not just what he said. What he said is awful. It's toxic. It's poisonous, and it shouldn't be given the light of day because it's just so awful. It's just hate. It's pure hatred.
It is pure hatred, and there is room for it in the current Conservative Party. And whether you're being sanguine about it, or philosophical, or defeatist, or indeed whether it's a form of trauma bonding, I don't think any of us should ever stop being shocked by it. I mean, regardless of what the reaction after shock is, you have to keep being shocked by it, and shocked by the fact that there's plenty of room for him in the Conservative Party long after the story has broken. Thank you, John. Sarah, like many of you, is very cross with me for forgetting to tell you about the Diane Abbott, Jeremy Corbyn story, the reasons why, back in the day, after a brief romantic interlude, Diane Abbott broke up with Jeremy Corbyn. I haven't forgotten, Sarah. I'll tell you after this.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 49 minutes after 12. Tony's been in touch. So this is surreal. Am I the only one who heard a nutter phone in? My mate Keith is listening in France. He says, I'm just tuning in from France, James. He's written WTAF is going on? Was that for real? So a little word of explanation. Colin from Portsmouth is one half of, just realising that quite a lot of people listening may not have realised this. He's one half of a rather splendid comedy duo called the Exploding Heads, who are on the road at the moment with their extremely... He goes to Tony's back into... He says, you've gone a bit weird since that crazy call that no one is talking about. What is going on? Tony, relax, mate. I'm no weirder than usual. Colin from Portsmouth is one half of the Exploding Heads comedy duo, and we thought it might be rather fun just to sort of slip it into the programme unannounced, as if it were part of the normal programme, because back in the day I used to get calls like that all the time. Kind of owe them the current level of my... Well, I think a lot of the popularity of the show is down to the calls like that we used to get, because they went viral, you tuned in, and happily you stayed, even though calls like that tend not to come through anymore. But relax, Tony, it was all part of the plan. Relax, Keith, in France. It was all part of the plan. It was completely for real. I haven't gone weird. And Colin from Portsmouth is on the road with the Exploding Heads at a venue near you soon. And you can find out more just by Googling the Exploding Heads. 10 to 1 is the time. And no, I'm not on commission. But frankly, after a plug like that, I should be. Back to the question of Frank. No, I should do the thing first before I forget. So I thought this was rather charming. And as I said to you earlier, it kind of endeared them both to me. So Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott, to use the parlance of a bygone age, they once stepped out together, as you probably know, in the late 1970s. And I think the real straw that broke the camel's back was actually spending Christmas with his family, which she described as an example of socialist frugality. I don't know why I just thought of the Cratchits. Did anyone else just... I know that wasn't their choice. But a Christmas of socialist frugality with boiled vegetables and turkey, in contrast to her jolly Jamaican Christmases. But a contributing factor to the breakdown of the relationship was the fact that she enjoyed the theatre and reading, and claims in her new book that Jeremy Corbyn spent all of his free time invested in party politics. Once, she writes, after I lamented our lack of social activity as a couple, he pondered it for a few days and told me we were going out. Feeling excited, she dressed up nicely before setting off in the car together to a surprise location. I had no idea where we were going, writes Diane Abbott in her new memoir. Perhaps a nice wine bar. It turned out that Jeremy's idea of a social outing was to drive me to Highgate Cemetery and proudly show me the tomb of Karl Marx. Their relations, she said, continued for a short while after the cemetery date before, to use her words, gradually collapsing. And who here can really be surprised? The MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, re-elected, of course, as a Labour MP after a row over whether she would be allowed to stand for the party. So sometimes the trials and tribulations she's faced have come from her own side of the House of Commons. But we're talking about an attack very much from the other side, from a Conservative, a £20 million donor to the Conservative Party. A final word before we go back to the phones. The comments were more misogynist than racist. He was attacking her gender more than her colour, which makes you a misogynist and is more of a reason not to vote Tory. Mate, if Idiot's Corner wasn't already full this week, I think you can go in early to next week's Idiot's Corner. It makes me a misogynist to talk about Frank Hester's racist and misogynist abuse of diet. Oh, forgive me, I shouldn't have read that out. It's the same bloke who said it wasn't racist in the first place, to describe how Diane Abbott makes someone want to hate all black women, and as a consequence of that, she should be shot. So you can only go in Idiot's Corner once. Seriously. It's not an opinion, it's counting. Jamie's in Wolverhampton. Jamie, what would you like to say?
Hi there. Yeah, I think for myself, as a mixed black-white male, who typically has voted Conservative, the comments, they were quite clearly racist comments.
Yes.
Whether the individual himself is racist, I would potentially argue slightly different. There's a different argument there to be made. Possibly so. I'm not defending him at all. The comments were abhorrent.
Sure.
But what I find is, coming from an ethnic minority background, is just because there are people that are racist or make racist comments, it doesn't necessarily dissuade you from being a member of that party. You can agree that...
No, but he bankrolls the entire party. The 20 million, without the £20 million donation, one has very little idea of what the Conservative Party would have looked like going into the last election. So all parties have got racists in them. All parties may have racists in positions of some prominence. And as you remind us, racism can be a nuanced accusation. I don't know quite how saying very, very racist things without actually being a racist works, but I'm not going to say that it's impossible. I think your point stands. But he bankrolls the entire party.
And that's what I'm coming to, really. Yeah. That the Conservatives were clearly in a very desperate position. And going forward, I think whoever does become the new leader, I think there's only one candidate who would be my option personally.
Who?
Tom Tugendhat.
I don't think there's much chance of that, to be honest with you, mate. You never know. Stranger things have happened.
I do quite like James Cleverly, but I think he's too close to the previous administrations, as are the rest. But the rest are kind of walking off a cliff edge, if you like. But yeah, I think that the new leader would do well to kind of drag the party back to centre.
And not take any more money from Frank Hester, or do you not mind either way?
Yes, no, going forward, they definitely shouldn't.
See, I'm uncomfortable telling you can't vote for them because of your ethnicity and his racism. That would sound wrong, right?
Yeah, and a conversation, your researcher asked me that, how I feel about anti-immigration from the Tories. And I have those anti-immigration views myself.
Fair enough.
As coming from an ethnic minority background.
And my thing is, coming from an ethnic minority background, is that we should culturally assimilate. And I think when you increase the levels of immigration, which I don't think are a bad thing, and they're certainly needed for the economy.
Very hard to culturally assimilate when, the main bankroller of the governing party at the time thinks that all black women thinks that you should hate all black women. You know that exists. I take your point, though. I want to play a little clip of Full Disclosure. We're going back into the memory banks this week because it struck me that I've got interviews with almost all of the very senior members of the current cabinet, about whom not a lot is known. So we'll start at the top with Keir Starmer, who sat down with me in 2022. I'm yet to hear, and I'm not being self-aggrandising. Well, I am, but I think with good cause. I'm yet to hear an interview that shows sides of his personality as light and as nuanced as we show here.
Sometimes when you get to lead the Labour Party, etc., people think, well, you must have been planning that all your life. Not true. It just didn't occur to me that I could be leader of the Labour Party when I was a teenager. And that's why I very happily went into law and then channeled that as a way of dealing with injustice. But it was that sense from my parents that, you've got the chance to go to university, you've got the chance to be a lawyer, you must take that chance. And their vicarious pride that they were part of something which allowed me to do that.
There's a line I've read from your dad when you got your knighthood, when he said they treated Keir like a lord, and they treated us like a lord's mum and dad.
Yeah, my mum and dad, they guessing when I got the knighthood at Buckingham Palace, and to some extent, all of that was about them and the pride that they had in that. They turned up. They, very typical of my mum and dad, I'm afraid. They by then they got a Great Dane, and the animals came first. My mum couldn't walk at that stage, so they had to take a car into Buckingham Palace, which is quite unusual because by then she'd lost the ability to walk. And so they've got this sort of beaten up old Volvo with a Great Dane in the back, which they've not cleared with security. And they've driven to the gates of Buckingham Palace, winding down the windows, saying, "We're here for Keir's knighthood." It's a sort of security, but pretty non-chuffed. The corgis were out, and so it's just, and in the end, I think they cajoled on the staff to sort of look after the Great Dane whilst they were in, watching me. But for them, it was an amazing moment of real pride for them, and very special in that respect, because again, they would have never expected their son to be getting knighted at Buckingham Palace. It was just not something that would ever have happened.
So a vindication of all of the hopes of their parenting.
And my dad in particular wasn't very good at showing pride.
No.
And not in himself, not in us. And so it was glimpsing it first-hand in that was really good. But as for bringing the Great Dane, absolutely, it didn't cross their mind that this would be a problem. They said, well, everybody loves dogs. We'll just drive the dog into Buckingham Palace and park the car up.
She's going to hang out with the corgis. I mean it. I think you should listen to that interview. If you're interested in having a slightly better insight into what the current Prime Minister is like, then you will find elsewhere. I must apologise. Simon Marks is in for Sheila Fogarty today. Simon, you've been doing a wonderful job. Have you been enjoying yourself?
I have been having a wonderful time, James. Unexpected to be in for Sheila this afternoon, but a joy nonetheless.
Well, welcome from everybody.
Thank you so much.
And apologies for stealing at least a minute
Not
and
at all.
counting.
You can have as
programme.
much of it as you would like.
Well, I'll be brief. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts, including Full Disclosure. So download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4 on LBC, but now, as I may have just revealed, Simon Marks is in for Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.